Welcome to Haunted Bedtime, where the most chilling stories meet the sound of rain to guide you into a restful sleep. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before you drift off, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable and relax. The headlights in my rearview mirror had been there for hours, a constant, unsettling presence on the empty highway. At first, I thought nothing of it. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the barren landscape, a chill ran down my spine. The truck was getting closer. I'd always dreamed of taking a solo road trip across the country. The open road, the freedom, the adventure. So when I finally got some time off work, I packed up my old Honda Civic and hit the highway. The first few days were everything I'd imagined. Singing along to the radio, stopping at quirky roadside attractions, and watching stunning sunsets paint the sky. But now, on day 4, something felt off. I had been driving through the desert for hours, the monotonous landscape broken only by the occasional cactus or weathered rock formation. The solitude that had once felt freeing now seemed oppressive. I glanced at my rearview mirror again. The truck was still there, a dark silhouette against the fading light. It had appeared behind me shortly after I stopped for gas at a small town about 100 miles back. At first, I barely noticed it. Plenty of people travel these roads, I told myself. But as the miles ticked by and no other cars passed us, unease began gnawing at my gut. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, watching the speedometer creep up -70, 75, 80 miles per hour. The truck matched my speed effortlessly, neither gaining nor losing ground. My palms began to sweat, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You're being paranoid," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. "It's just someone going the same way you are, that's all." But even as I said the words, I knew I didn't believe them. There was something deliberate in the way the truck maintained its distance, something predatory. I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest stop, and made a split-second decision. Maybe I could lose them there. I flicked on my turn signal and took the exit, my heart pounding as I watched the rearview mirror. The truck followed. The rest stop was little more than a parking lot with a small building housing restrooms and vending machines. A couple of semi-trucks were parked in the far corner, their drivers likely catching some sleep. I pulled into a spot near the building, under the harsh glow of a flickering streetlight. The truck rumbled into the lot behind me, circling around before parking a few spaces away. I sat frozen in my seat, engine idling, as I watched the driver's door open in my side mirror. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered. In the dim light, I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his eyes on me. He stood there for a moment, then started walking toward my car. Panic surged through me. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the parking spot, tires squealing. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man break into a run, heading back to his truck. I shot out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, my breath coming in short gasps. The truck's engine roared to life behind me, headlights blazing as it gave chase. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," I chanted, pushing my little Civic as fast as it would go. The needle on the speedometer crept past 90, then 100 miles per hour. The truck kept pace, growing larger in my mirror. My mind raced. What did this person want? Why were they following me? I fumbled for my phone with one hand, keeping the other white-knuckled on the wheel. No signal. Of course. I was in the middle of nowhere. The truck was getting closer now, its grille filling my rearview mirror. I could see the driver, a dark shape behind the windshield. My car shuddered as we passed 110 miles per hour. Suddenly, the truck swerved into the left lane. My breath caught in my throat as it pulled up alongside me. I risked a glance over, and immediately wished I hadn't. The driver was staring right at me, a twisted grin visible even in the darkness. He revved his engine and swerved toward me. I jerked the wheel, nearly running off the road as I dodged the much larger vehicle. Heart pounding, I searched desperately for an escape route. Up ahead, I spotted a turnoff. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. My tires screeched in protest as I flew down the exit ramp, narrowly missing the guardrail. The new road was narrower, winding through rocky hills. I took the curves as fast as I dared, praying I wouldn't lose control. In my mirror, I saw the truck's headlights swing wide as it took the turn too fast. Buying me a few precious seconds, I pushed my car to its limits, taking each turn faster than the last. The engine whined in protest, but I couldn't slow down. Not now. Trees whipped by in a dark blur, and I had no idea where this road led. But anywhere was better than being run down on the highway. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I spotted lights up ahead. A town, maybe. Relief surged through me. Surely I'd be safe there. I could find a police station, or at least somewhere public to hide. But as I got closer, my heart sank. It wasn't a town at all, but a large gated property. A sign flashed by too quickly for me to read. Some kind of factory, maybe. I slammed on my brakes as I approached the gate, skidding to a stop just short of the heavy metal bars. A small guardhouse stood to one side, but it was dark and empty. No, I muttered, looking around frantically. The gate was my only hope of safety. But how could I get through? The sound of an engine roaring in the distance spurred me into action. I leaped out of my car and ran to the guardhouse, praying I'd find some way to open the gate. A button, a switch, anything. I had barely reached the small building when headlights illuminated the area, accompanied by the roar of a powerful engine. The truck had found me. Time seemed to slow as I watched it barrel down the road towards me. In that moment, I knew with terrifying certainty that he wasn't going to stop. He was going to ram right through my car, the gate, and me. Pure instinct took over. I dove to the side, rolling into a ditch just as the truck slammed into my poor Civic. The sound of crunching metal and breaking glass filled the air. The force of the impact shoved my car into the gate, which groaned but held firm. I lay there in the dirt, ears ringing, too stunned to move. The truck's engine was still running, its menacing rumble filling the night. Then I heard a car door open and heavy footsteps approaching. "Come on out, sweetheart," a gravelly voice called. "No need to hide. I just want to talk." Fear jolted through me like an electric shock. I scrambled deeper into the ditch, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by an eerie whistle. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the man said, his tone conversational, as if we were old friends. "I've been watching you for days, waiting for the right moment. You're a cautious one, I'll give you that, but everyone lets their guard down eventually." My blood ran cold. Days? Had he been following me this whole time? Memories flashed through my mind. A truck I'd noticed at a few gas stations, a man watching me in a diner mirror. Oh God, how had I not realized? I needed to run, to get away, but terror kept me frozen in place. The footsteps stopped right above me. I could see the man's boots at the edge of the ditch, inches from my face. "Found you," he said softly. A hand reached down, grabbing my arm in an iron grip. I screamed, thrashing wildly as he dragged me up the slope. In the moonlight, I could finally see his face, weathered, with cold eyes and a cruel smile. "Let me go," I yelled, kicking and clawing at him, but he was so much stronger. He effortlessly held me at arm's length as I struggled. "Feisty," he chuckled. "I like that. Makes things more interesting." He started dragging me towards the truck, and I knew with sickening certainty that if he got me inside, I was done for. Desperation gave me strength. I twisted in his grasp and sank my teeth into his arm as hard as I could. He yelled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. Without thinking, I ran, not toward the road, but toward the gate. My fingers scrambled at the metal bars, desperately searching for any kind of handhold. I'd barely climbed a few feet when I felt his hands grabbing at my legs, trying to pull me down. I kicked back blindly, feeling the surge of vicious satisfaction when my foot connected with something solid. The man grunted in pain, and adrenaline surged through my veins. I climbed faster than I thought possible, barbed wire at the top of the fence biting into my hands. But I barely felt it. I threw myself over the top and fell hard on the other side, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there, gasping, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no engine revving, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. Through the bars of the gate, I could see the man standing by his truck. He wasn't trying to follow. He just stood there, watching me with those cold, predatory eyes. "Better run, little rabbit," he called, his voice echoing in the night. "I'll be seeing you again real soon." Then he got into his truck and drove away, the tail lights disappearing into the darkness. I sank to my knees, my body shaking with delayed shock and terror. I was alive. I had escaped, but the nightmare was far from over. As I sat there, bleeding and bruised, on the wrong side of a fence in the middle of nowhere, one thought kept running through my mind. How long until he came back to finish what he'd started? The crunch of dead leaves under my boots was the only sound in the forest until I heard it. A distant, haunting whisper that made my blood run cold. I froze, straining my ears, but the whisper didn't come again. Just the wind, I told myself. But as I stood there, alone in the deepening twilight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I'd always loved hiking, the thrill of exploring nature, of pushing my limits. This trail in the Appalachians was supposed to be my biggest challenge yet, a week-long solo trek through some of the most remote wilderness on the East Coast. I'd prepared for months, studying maps, upgrading my gear, getting into the best shape of my life. What I hadn't prepared for was the soul-crushing loneliness. 3 days in, and I hadn't seen another human being since I'd left the trailhead. The isolation that had seemed so appealing when I'd planned this trip now felt oppressive. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I shook my head, trying to clear the paranoid thoughts. "Get it together, Mike," I muttered to myself. "You wanted solitude, remember?" Hitching my backpack higher on my shoulders, I pressed on. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and blocking out what little remained of the fading daylight. I clicked on my headlamp, its narrow beam barely penetrating the gloom ahead. That's when I saw it, a flicker of light through the trees, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. I blinked, and it was gone. But no, there it was again, a warm yellow glow, like a candle in a window. My heart raced. A cabin. Out here. It wasn't on any of my maps, but the promise of shelter, and maybe even company, was too tempting to ignore. I veered off the trail, pushing through thick underbrush towards the light. As I got closer, the cabin came into view. It was old. Really old. The log walls were weathered gray, the roof sagging under the weight of years. But there was definitely a light in the window, wavering like a candle flame. I approached cautiously, leaves crunching under my feet. The porch creaked ominously as I stepped onto it. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. Something felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and that unsettling feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Before I could talk myself out of it, I tried the door handle. It turned easily, and the door swung open with a long, eerie creak. "Hello," I called out, poking my head inside. "Anyone home?" Silence answered me. The interior was a single room, dimly lit by a lantern on a rickety table. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. It looked like no one had been here in years. And yet, the lantern was lit. And there, on the table beside it, was a steaming mug of what smelled like coffee. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been here, and recently. But where were they now? I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and get back on the trail. But exhaustion and curiosity won out. I stepped inside, letting my backpack slip to the floor. The smell of the coffee was intoxicating, especially after days of nothing but trail mix and protein bars. I picked up the mug, feeling its warmth seep into my cold fingers. It couldn't hurt to take just one sip, could it? I raised the mug to my lips, then froze. There on the far wall was a corkboard covered in photos, dozens of them, all of hikers on the trail. And in every single one, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was a dark figure lurking in the background. The mug slipped from my numb fingers, shattering on the floor. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the porch steps. Panic seized me. I looked around wildly for a place to hide, but the cabin was too small, too open. The footsteps grew closer, each creak of the porch boards like a gunshot in the silence. There was a small window on the far wall. Without thinking, I lunged for it, yanking it open and squeezing through just as the door began to open. I tumbled to the ground outside, the leaves cushioning my fall. For a moment, I lay there, too terrified to move. I could hear movement inside the cabin, slow and methodical. Then a voice, low and gravelly, sent chills down my spine. "I know you're out there," it said. "I can smell your fear." I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring about the noise I made crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I just ran, blind panic driving me deeper into the dark forest. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I collapsed against a tree, my lungs burning, legs shaking. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit, but heard nothing except the pounding of my own heart. As the adrenaline faded, rational thought began to return. I needed to get out of these woods, fast. But in my panicked flight, I'd lost all sense of direction. My backpack, with all my supplies, was still in the cabin. I had no food, no water, no map, just the clothes on my back and my headlamp, which chose that moment to flicker ominously. "Think, Mike, think," I muttered, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The North Star. If I could find it, I could at least figure out which direction to go. I looked up, searching for a break in the canopy. Instead, my blood turned to ice. There, not 20 feet away, was a figure standing motionless between the trees. In the dim light, I could just make out the outline of a man, tall and gaunt. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the shadows, I told myself. It had to be. But then I saw it again, closer this time. And again, on the other side. It was toying with me. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around. Nothing there. But when I turned back, the figure was right in front of me. I caught a glimpse of pale skin, sunken eyes, and teeth bared in a feral grin. Then it lunged. I screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard. I scrambled away on all fours, expecting at any moment to feel hands grabbing me. But when I looked back, the clearing was empty. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? A low chuckle echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Run all you want," that gravelly voice said. "You'll never leave my forest." I staggered to my feet and ran again, blind terror giving me strength I didn't know I had. I crashed through bushes, leaped over fallen logs, my only thought to get away, to find help, to wake up from this nightmare. The voice followed me, always just behind, taunting me. "I've walked these woods for centuries," it said. "Your fear feeds me. Your despair sustains me." I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing. In a small clearing, my lungs felt like they were on fire. I couldn't run anymore. This was how I died, alone in the woods, hunted by whatever that thing was. As I lay there waiting for the end, a new sound cut through the night, a dog barking, then voices, human voices calling. Out flashlight beams swept through the trees. "Hello," I croaked, my voice hoarse. "Help, I'm over here." The voices grew closer. I heard my name being called. "Park. Rangers, they've been searching for me for days ever since I failed to check in at my designated waypoint. As the Rangers burst into the clearing, release flooded through me. I was safe, it was over. But as they helped me to my feet, I saw it one last time, a pale face watching from the shadows, those sunken eyes filled with hunger and rage. Then it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the forest. The Rangers said I was lucky to be alive. Exposure, dehydration, a nasty concussion from where I'd hit my head falling by. All rights, I shouldn't have survived. They didn't believe my ramblings about the cabin or the creature in the woods. As my strength returned, even I began to doubt my memories. Maybe it had all been a hallucination brought on by my injuries, but sometimes late at night I still hear that growly chuckle, and I know that somewhere out there in the deepest, darkest part of the forest, something is waiting, watching, hungry for the next foolish hiker who wanders off the trail. I'll never go into those woods again, but part of me, the part that still wakes up screaming from nightmares of pale skin and feral grins, wonders if I ever truly left. The moment I saw his eyes in the rearview mirror, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. There was something off about them, a coldness that sent chills down my spine. But by then it was too late. We were already in his truck, miles from anywhere, with no way out. It had started as a perfect day. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I were on a road trip through the Southwest. Just the two of us, our beat-up Corolla, and the open road. We've been dating for 2 years, and this trip was our way of celebrating 3 weeks of freedom before we had to go back to our jobs in the real world. The trouble started somewhere in the middle of Nevada. We were on a long, empty stretch of highway when our car started making a weird rattling noise. I tried to ignore it at first, turning up the radio and telling Sarah it was probably nothing, but then smoke started pouring out from under the hood. I muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. Sarah gave me a worried look. As I got out to check the engine, I popped the hood and was immediately engulfed in a cloud of acrid smoke. Coughing, I waved it away and peered inside. I'm no mechanic, but even I could tell this was bad. Something had blown, and there was oil everywhere. What's wrong? Sarah asked, coming to stand beside me. I shook my head. I have no idea, but we're not driving anywhere in this. We both looked up and down the highway. Nothing but desert in every direction, shimmering in the late afternoon heat. We hadn't passed another car in at least an hour. What do we do? Sarah's voice had an edge of panic to it. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I guess we wait and hope someone drives by, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We sat on the hood of the car, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. An hour passed, then 2. The temperature dropped rapidly as night approached. Still no cars. We can't stay out here all night, Sarah said, shivering. It's going to get freezing. I was about to suggest we try walking to find cell service when we saw the headlights. A truck was approaching from the direction we'd come. Relief washed over me as I stood up, waving my arms. The truck slowed and pulled over in front of us. It was an old pickup covered in dust and DSE. The driver's door opened, and a man got out. He was tall and wiry, probably in his 50s, with weathered skin and a scraggly gray beard. He wore dirty jeans and a flannel shirt. Despite the heat, you folks having some trouble? He called out as he approached. I nodded. Yeah, our car broke down. We've been stuck here for hours. He peered under the hood, then shook his head. That's not going anywhere without a tow. Nearest town's about 60 miles back. My heart sank. We'd never make it that far on foot, especially not at night. The man seemed to read my thoughts. I can give you a ride if you want. I'm heading that way anyhow. I glanced at Sarah. She looked hesitant, and I couldn't blame her. Getting into a stranger's car in the middle of nowhere went against everything we'd ever been taught. But what choice did we have? That would be great, I said. Thank you. We grabbed our backpacks from the car and climbed into the truck. It smelled of cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. The man introduced himself as Earl as he started driving. At first everything seemed fine. Earl made small talk, asking about our trip and where we were from. But as we drove, I started to notice little things that set me on edge. The way his eyes kept flicking to Sarah in the rearview mirror, how he'd sometimes trail off mid-sentence like he was distracted by some private thought. And then there was the smell. That odd scent I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, metallic and vaguely sour. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place it. We'd been driving for about half an hour when Earl suddenly turned off the highway onto a dirt road shortcut. He said, noticing my confused look, "Save us." Sometime I wanted to object, to tell him to stick to the main road, but something in his tone made me hold my tongue. Sarah squeezed my hand, and I could feel her trembling slightly. The dirt road wound through the desert, lit only by the truck's headlights. We bounced and jolted over the rough terrain. Earl had stopped talking now, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. After about 10 minutes, he pulled to a stop in front of an old rundown gas station. The windows were boarded up, and a faded sign hung crookedly above the door. "Got to take a leak," Earl said, turning off the engine. "Won't be a minute." He got out, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Sarah turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," she whispered urgently. "Something's not right." I nodded, my mouth dry. "I know, but where would we go?" "We're in the middle of nowhere." Before she could answer, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a muffled scream coming from inside the gas station. We both froze, straining our ears. There it was again, louder this time, a woman's voice, and crying out in terror. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, "there's someone in there." I reached for the door handle, my heart pounding, but before I could open it, Earl was back. He slid into the driver's seat, a strange smile on his face. "All set," he said cheerfully. "Let's get going." I caught Sarah's eye. She gave a tiny nod. We both knew we couldn't leave, not if someone was in trouble. "Actually," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to use the bathroom too. Is it okay if I—" Earl's smile vanished. "No need for that. We're almost there, please," I insisted. "It'll just take a second." For a moment, I thought he was going to refuse, but then he shrugged. "Suit yourself, but make it quick." I got out of the truck, my legs shaking as I walked towards the gas station. I heard Earl's door open behind me. "I'll come with you," he said. "Make sure you don't get lost." Panic surged through me. I reached the door and tried the handle. Locked. "It's around back," Earl said. "Far too close behind me." I turned to face him. Backing up against the door, I heard someone screaming. I said, dropping all pretense, "What's going on here?" Earl's face twisted into a snarl. "You should have minded your own business, boy." He lunged at me faster than I would have thought possible for a man his age. I ducked, feeling his fingers graze my hair. I shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backwards, and ran. "Sarah," I yelled. "Run!" I saw her jump out of the truck, her face pale with terror. Earl was right behind me, cursing and spitting. I reached Sarah and grabbed her hand, pulling her along as we sprinted into the darkness. We ran blindly, stumbling over rocks and scrub brush. I could hear Earl crashing through the desert behind us. Getting closer, Sarah tripped and fell, crying out in pain. I hauled her to her feet, but those few seconds were all Earl needed. He tackled me from behind, driving me to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I struggled, trying to throw him off, but he was strong, his weight pinning me down. "Get off him!" Sarah screamed. I saw her grab a rock and bring it down hard on Earl's head. He grunted in pain and rolled off me. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air. Earl was already getting up, blood trickling down the side of his face. "You're going to regret that," he growled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wicked-looking knife. The blade glinted in the moonlight as he advanced on us. Time seemed to slow down. I looked around desperately for something, anything we could use to defend ourselves. That's when I saw it. The glint of metal half buried in the sand, a pipe or a piece of rebar. I couldn't tell which, but it was something. I dove for it just as Earl lunged at Sarah. My hand closed around cold metal, and I swung without thinking. There was a sickening crunch as the pipe connected with Earl's skull. He dropped like a stone. For a moment, we just stood there, panting. Earl lay motionless at our feet. I felt numb, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Sarah's voice snapped me back to reality. "We need to go now." I nodded, still clutching the pipe. "The gas station. We need to check." We approached the building cautiously. The back door was locked with a heavy padlock. I smashed it open with the pipe, my hands shaking. The interior was dark and musty, we found a light switch, and fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing a scene out of a nightmare. The room was filled with cages, and in those cages I won't describe what we saw. Some things are better left unsaid, but we got those people out. We called the police. From the gas station's old landline, they came along with ambulances and a whole circus of FBI agents. They told us later that Earl had been operating in the area for years, that we'd stumbled onto something bigger and darker than we could have imagined. They called us heroes, but in my dreams I still see Earl's cold eyes in the rearview mirror. I still smell that metallic sour scent, and I wonder how many other Earls are out there prowling the lonely highways waiting for someone's car to break down. Sarah and I, we don't take road trips anymore. Some roads, once you've been down them, you can never go back. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart, and then cutting through the silence like a knife, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to pick the lock on my front door. I'd always loved thunderstorms, the raw power of nature, the way the whole world seemed to pause and hold its breath. But this storm was different. It had rolled in suddenly, fierce and unrelenting, bringing with it a blackout that plunged the entire city into darkness. At first I hadn't been too concerned. Power outages happened especially during storms like this. I'd lit some candles, dug out my emergency radio, and settled in to wait it out. The battery-operated radio crackled with updates. The storm had knocked out power to most of the city, and it could be hours before it was restored. As the evening wore on, I found myself growing uneasy. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder. I lived alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. Usually I could hear my neighbors, the hum of traffic from the street below, but now there was nothing. I tried calling my sister, but the cell networks were down, too cut off from the world. I felt incredibly alone. It was nearing midnight when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from my front door. At first I thought it might be my neighbor's cat. It sometimes wandered the hallways scratching at doors for attention, but as I listened I realized this sound was different, more deliberate, methodical. Someone was trying to kick my lock. Fear gripped me, icy tendrils wrapping around my heart. I stood frozen, straining my ears. The scratching continued, punctuated by the soft click of metal on metal. My mind raced. Who would be trying to break in during a blackout? Opportunistic burglar, thinking the residents would be away, or something worse. I looked around frantically for a weapon, cursing myself for never buying that baseball bat my sister had suggested. The best I could find was a heavy flashlight. I gripped it tightly, my palms slick with sweat. The scratching stopped for a moment. There was silence. Then a soft click, the sound of my lock disengaging. Panic surged through me. I had to do something, had to stop them from getting in. On shaking legs I crept towards the door. If I could just engage the chain lock, maybe they'd give up and go away. I reached for the chain, my fingers fumbling in the dark. Just as I was about to slide it into place, the door began to open. Time seemed to slow down. I saw a hand appear in the gap, pale and thin. Without thinking, I slammed the door as hard as I could. There was a sickening crunch and a howl of pain. The hand disappeared, and I heard a thud as someone fell back into the hallway, adrenaline coursing through me. As I slammed the door shut and engaged every lock. Then I backed away, brandishing my flashlight like a club. "I've called the police," I shouted, hoping my voice didn't betray my terror. "They're on their way right now." It was a lie, of course. With the phones down, there was no way to call for help, but maybe it would be enough to scare them off. For a long moment there was silence. Then a voice came from the other side of the door, low, raspy, filled with barely contained rage. "You shouldn't have done that." The word sent chills down my spine. This wasn't some random burglar. This person, whoever they were, had come for me. Specifically, I heard movement in the hallway, the sound of someone getting to their feet, then a thud against my door, hard enough to make it shudder in its frame. They were trying to break it down. I backed away, my mind racing. The fire escape. If I could just make it to the window, I could climb down to the street. Another thud, louder this time. The wood of the door creaked ominously. I turned and ran for the bedroom where the fire escape was behind me. I heard the splintering of wood they were getting. Through I reached the window and yanked it open. Cold rain lashing my face. I climbed out onto the metal grating of the fire escape, the wind buffeting me as I began to descend one floor down 2. My foot slipped on the wet metal and I nearly fell. I clung to the railing, heart pounding. A flash of lightning illuminated the world for a brief moment, and there, looking down at me from my bedroom window, was a figure, tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. I scrambled down the last flight of stairs and dropped to the alley below, pain shooting through my ankles as I landed, but I couldn't stop. I ran. The rain was coming down in sheets, now soaking me to the bone. I ran blindly through the dark streets, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran. Eventually I found myself in a part of the city I didn't recognize. The streets were narrow here, the buildings old and crumbling. I slowed to a walk, gasping for breath, trying to get my bearings. That's when I saw the church. It was a small, ancient-looking building, its spire barely visible through the rain. But the door was open, warm light spilling out onto the street. Without thinking, I stumbled towards it. As I got closer, I could hear singing a hymn, soft and comforting. I reached the doorway and collapsed to my knees. Exhausted, an elderly woman in a nun's habit appeared, concern etched on her face. "My child," she said, helping me to my feet. "What's happened to you?" I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I just shook my head, tears mixing with the rain on my face. She led me inside to a small room off the main chapel. There were others there. I realized people huddled on cots and chairs, talking in low voices, other refugees from the storm. The nun, Sister Mary, she introduced herself, brought me a blanket and a cup of hot tea. As the warmth seeped back into my body, I found myself telling her everything about the break-in, the chase through the city, the terrifying figure I'd seen. She listened patiently, her face grave. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're safe here," she said. "Finally, this is holy ground. No evil can enter." I wanted to believe her, but as I looked around at the flickering candles, the shadows dancing on the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that nowhere was truly safe. The night wore on. I dozed, fitfully jerking awake at every sound. Each time Sister Mary was there, murmuring words of comfort. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. The other refugees started to leave, heading back to their homes and lives. But I couldn't bring myself to go. Sister Mary seemed to understand. She brought me more tea, sat with me as the morning light slowly filled the room. "What am I going to do?" I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper. She took my hand in hers, her skin papery and soft. "You survived," she said. "That's the first step. Now you heal." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. But as I sat there in that small room that smelled of incense and old stone, I felt something I hadn't felt in hours. Hope. The police came later that morning. They took my statement, promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. With no evidence, no witnesses, it was just another strange story in a city full of them. I couldn't go back to my apartment. The thought of those eyes, that voice, was too much. Sister Mary helped me find a shelter somewhere I could stay until I figured out my next move. As I prepared to leave the church, she pressed something into my hand. It was a small silver cross on a chain for protection, she said with a gentle smile. I slipped it over my head, feeling its weight against my chest. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." She nodded, her eyes kind. "Remember, my child, the darkness may seem overwhelming, Ron, but there is always light to be found. You just have to know where to look." I stepped out into the morning sun, blinking at its brightness. The city was coming back to life, power restored, people going about their day as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I had seen the darkness that lurked in the shadows, waiting for its chance, and I knew that someday, somehow, I would have to face it again. For now, though I was alive, I was safe. And as I walked down the street, the silver cross cool against my skin, I realized that was enough. It had to be. The first shotgun blast nearly took my head off. It whistled past my ear, shattering the calm of the forest and sending birds scattering into the sky. In that moment, I realized our quiet camping trip had just become a fight for survival. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, my friends, and I had been planning this camping trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. There were four of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and our mutual friend Mike. We'd found a spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual campgrounds and hiking trails, the kind of place where you could really feel alone in the wilderness. The drive out had been full of laughter and excitement. We sang along to old road trip playlists, stopped at quirky roadside attractions, and marveled at the changing landscape as urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. We arrived at our campsite late Friday afternoon. It was perfect, a small clearing near a babbling brook, surrounded by towering pines. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful evening under the stars. That first night was everything we'd hoped for. We roasted marshmallows, told ghost stories, and stayed up late talking and laughing. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found such an untouched piece of paradise. Saturday morning, we woke up early, eager to explore. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and camp coffee, we set off on a hike. The trail was rough and overgrown, clearly not used much, but that only added to the sense of adventure. We spent hours wandering through the woods, marveling at hidden waterfalls and spotting wildlife. It was on our way back to camp that things started to feel off. I noticed at first a stillness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. The birds had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed to have died down. Guys, I said, stopping in my tracks, do you hear that? Jake looked at me confused. Hear what exactly? I replied, nothing, it's too quiet. As if on cue, a twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush. We all whirled towards the sound, but there was nothing there, just shadows and leaves. Leaves, it's probably just a deer, Sarah said, but her voice was tense. We picked up our pace, suddenly eager to get back to the relative safety of our campsite. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. We burst into our clearing, half expecting to find our camp ransacked by bears or other wildlife, but everything was exactly as we'd left it. We all let out a collective sigh of relief, see, Mike said, forcing a laugh. We were worried over nothing, but our relief was short-lived. As we started to prepare dinner, we heard the sound of an engine in the distance. It grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on gravel. Someone was coming down the old logging road that led to our campsite. A battered pickup truck burst into the clearing, skidding to a stop in a cloud of dust. Three men got out, all of them burly and bearded, wearing dirty flannel shirts and camo pants. They looked like something out of Deliverance, and my stomach dropped as I realized we were in trouble. The oldest of the three, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. Well, he drawled, what do we have here? Jake, always the diplomat, tried to defuse the situation. Hey there, he said, forcing a smile, we're just camping for the weekend. Is this your land? We didn't mean to trespass. If it is, the man's eyes narrowed, this ain't your land, city boy. This here's our hunting grounds, has been for generations. I glanced at the others, seeing my own fear reflected in their eyes. We were miles from anywhere, with no cell service. If these men decided to cause trouble, there was no one around to help us. We're sorry, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. We didn't know. We can leave if you want. The man considered this for a moment, then shook his head. Nah, you folks ain't going nowhere, not till we decide what to do with you. That's when I noticed the guns. Each of the men had a rifle slung over their shoulder, and the leader had a shotgun in his hands. My blood ran cold as I realized just how bad our situation was. The next few hours were a nightmare. The men made us sit around our campfire while they ransacked our tents, helping themselves to our food and beer. They taunted us, making crude jokes and veiled threats. I could see Jake getting angrier by the minute, his fists clenched at his sides. I prayed he wouldn't do anything stupid. As night fell, the men's mood seemed to darken. They started arguing Among themselves, their voices getting louder and more aggressive. I caught snatches of their conversation, something about teaching us a lesson and making an example. That's when I knew we had to get out of there. I caught Jake's eye and nodded slightly towards the woods. He understood immediately, and I saw him whisper something to Sarah and Mike. We waited for our chance, tensed and ready to run. It came when the youngest of the men stumbled away from the fire to relieve himself. In that moment of distraction, we bolted. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we ran. Behind us, I heard shouts of anger, then the sound that will haunt my nightmares forever, the boom of a shotgun. The blast missed us, but only just. I felt the wind of its passage, heard the pellets tearing through leaves. Inches from my head, we ran harder, pure adrenaline driving us forward. The men were right behind us, crashing through the woods like angry bears. I could hear them shouting, their voices filled with rage and bloodlust. Another shot rang out, then another. They were firing blindly into the darkness, hoping to hit us. By sheer luck, we ran for what felt like hours, our lungs burning, our legs trembling with exhaustion. The sounds of pursuit faded, then disappeared entirely. But still we ran, too terrified to stop. Finally, we couldn't go any further. We collapsed in a small gully, gasping for breath. For a long time, no one spoke. We just lay there, listening intently for any sign that we've been followed. What do we do now? Sarah whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I looked around at my friends, saw the terror in their eyes. We were lost in the wilderness with no supplies, no phones, and no idea which direction would lead us to safety. And somewhere out there, 3 armed and angry men were hunting us. We keep moving, I said, forcing myself to sound more confident than I felt. We head downhill. Eventually we'll hit a road or a town. It was a long, terrifying night. We stumbled through the darkness, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment we hear the roar of an engine or the crack of a rifle. By dawn, we were exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in scratches and bruises, but we were alive. And as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, we heard the most beautiful sound in the world: cars. We'd reached a highway. The police were skeptical of our story at first, but when they went to investigate our campsite, they found evidence of the men's presence: beer cans, cigarette butts, and spent shotgun shells. A manhunt was launched, but as far as I know, they never caught the men who terrorized us that night. It's been years since that camping trip, but the memories are still fresh. I haven't been able to go into the woods since then. The rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig, they all bring me right back to that night of terror, my friends. And we don't talk about it much, but sometimes when we're together, I'll catch one of them looking over their shoulder, scanning the tree line with wary eyes. And I know they're remembering too. We were lucky we survived, but sometimes I wonder about those men, and I can't help but think, are they still out there, still hunting in those woods, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to wander into their territory? I hope not, but just in case, I'll stick to the city from now on. Some wilderness, I've learned, is better left unexplored. The first thing I noticed was the smell, acrid chemical. Wrong, it hit me as soon as I opened the warehouse house door, and in that moment I knew I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I'd been working the night shift at Midwest Distribution for about 6 months. It was a boring job, but it paid the bills. Every night from 10 p.m. to 6 o'clock a.m., I'd patrol the massive warehouse complex, making sure everything was secure. Nothing ever happened until that night. It was a Tuesday just after midnight. I was making my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, shoes echoing on the concrete floor. The warehouse was huge, filled with rows upon rows of shelves, stacked high with boxes and pallets. During the day it was a hive of activity, but at night it was eerily silent. I just finished checking the east wing when I noticed something odd, a faint light coming from under the door of storage unit 17. That unit had been empty for months or so. I thought, curious, I approached the door, my hand instinctively going to the radio at my belt. The smell hit me as soon as I cracked the door open. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before, a mix of ammonia, bleach, and something else I couldn't identify. My eyes watered and I had to stifle a cough blinking away tears. I shone my flashlight into the unit. What I saw made my blood run cold. The space was filled with makeshift tables, each covered in beers tubes and other equipment I vaguely recognized from high school chemistry. In the center of it all was a large apparatus that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, bubbling and hissing ominously. It didn't take a genius to figure out what I was looking at. A drug lab, and a big one at that. My mind raced. How long had this been here? Who was behind it? And most importantly, what the hell was I supposed to do now? I knew I should call the police immediately, but something held me back. This was way bigger than some small-time operation. The scale, the sophistication of the equipment. This had to be the work of a major criminal organization. And if they could set up a lab right under our noses, who knew how deep their influence ran? As I stood there frozen with indecision, I heard a noise that made my heart stop. Footsteps coming from deeper in the unit. I killed my flashlight and ducked behind a stack of boxes, praying I hadn't been seen. Two men emerged from behind a makeshift partition. Even in the dim light I could see they were trouble. One was tall and wiry with tattoos covering his arms. The other was built like a linebacker with a shaved head and cold, dead eyes. They were talking in low voices, but I could catch snippets of their conversation. Shipments late, boss. Ain't happy. Told you we should have stuck with the Mexicans. These new guys are unreliable. Yeah, well, money talks, and their product is pure as it gets. I held my breath, not daring to move. They were standing between me and the exit. If they spotted me, I was dead. No question about it. If the men continued their conversation, oblivious to my presence, they discussed shipments, territories, something about a rival gang muscling in on their turf. With each word, I felt the weight of what I had stumbled into growing heavier. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they headed back behind the partition. I waited until I couldn't hear their footsteps any more, then slowly, carefully made my way to the door. I slipped out of the unit, gently closing the door behind me. As soon as it clicked shut, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the security office, my lungs burning and sweat pouring down my face. Safely inside, I locked the door and collapsed into my chair, trying to process what I'd just seen. I knew I had to call the police, but as my hand reached for the phone, a terrible thought struck me. How had this lab been set up without anyone noticing? The equipment, the chemicals. It would have taken multiple people and vehicles to bring it all, and someone had to have seen something. Unless someone on the inside was involved. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If someone at Midwest Distribution was working with these criminals, who could I trust? For all I knew, my own boss could be in on it. I sat there for a long time, weighing my options. If I went to the police, I risked tipping off whoever was involved. They might destroy the evidence, or worse, come after me. But if I kept quiet, I'd be letting a major drug operation continue right under my nose. In the end, I decided to wait. I needed more information, needed to figure out who I could trust for the rest of my shift. I tried to act normal, all the while my mind racing with possibilities and fears. When 6:00 a.m. rolled around, I clocked out like usual. But instead of heading home, I drove to the library. I spent hours there, using their computers to research drug operations, criminal organizations, and how to gather evidence safely. That night, I came to work prepared. I bought a small, high-quality camera and a voice recorder. As I made my rounds, I kept my eyes peeled for anything suspicious. It didn't take long to spot Mike, one of the forklift operators on the night shift. Kept making trips to and from storage Unit 17 each time. He'd glance around furtively before entering. I managed to snap a few photos without him noticing. Later, I overheard him on the phone, talking in hushed tones about product and minute distribution channels. Over the next week, I gathered more evidence. Photos, recordings, notes on suspicious activities and personnel. I was careful, always watching my back, never staying in one place too long. But I knew I was playing a dangerous game. These people were professionals, and sooner or later, they'd realize someone was onto them. My paranoia grew with each passing day. Every glance from a coworker, every unexpected noise, sent my heart racing. I barely slept, jumping at every sound in my apartment. Finally, after 2 weeks of this, I decided I had enough evidence. It was time to go to the authorities. I didn't trust the local police in a town this size. There was too much chance of the wrong people finding out. Instead, I reached out to the State Bureau of Investigation. I sent them an anonymous tip along with some of the evidence I'd gathered. Then I waited every day, a nerve-wracking ordeal, as I wondered if today would be the day they acted or the day I was discovered. It happened on a Friday night. I was halfway through my shift when suddenly the warehouse was swarming with armed agents. They moved with precision, securing exits and rounding up employees. I watched from the shadows as they breached Storage Unit 17, heard the shouts and sounds of struggle. Mike and several others were let out in handcuffs, looking shocked and angry. An agent approached me, flashing a badge. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions." I nodded, relief washing over me. It was over. I'd done the right thing. The next few hours were a blur of interviews and statements. I told them everything I knew, handed over all my evidence. They seemed impressed by the thoroughness of my investigation. "You took a big risk." One agent told me, "These people, they're part of a cartel that's been trying to establish a foothold in the Midwest. They wouldn't have hesitated to kill you if they'd found out." The gravity of what I'd been involved in hit me. Then I'd known it was dangerous, but hearing it laid out like that, I realized just how close I'd come to disaster. In the end, my evidence helped bring down not just the lab, but a significant portion of the cartel's Midwest operation. The agent told me I'd probably saved lives, prevented who knows how many kilos of drugs from hitting the streets. I should have felt proud. Instead, I just felt tired and scared. The State Bureau offered me witness protection, a new name, a new life somewhere far away. Part of me wanted to refuse to believe I could just go back to my old life, but I knew better. The cartel would be looking for whoever had betrayed them, and they had a long memory and a longer reach. So I said yes, left behind everything and everyone I knew. It wasn't easy starting over. There are days I miss my old life terribly, but then I think about that night in the warehouse, the acrid smell, the bubbling chemicals. I think about the lives that might have been ruined by the drugs produced there, and I know I made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost, but it's a cost worth paying. Now I live in a small town on the West Coast. I have a new job, new friends. To them, I'm just another face in the crowd. They don't know about my past, about the night that changed everything. But sometimes when I catch a certain scent on the wind, chemical, acrid, wrong, I'm right back there in that warehouse. And I remember that sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones hiding in plain sight. The moment I saw their eyes, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Cold, empty, devoid of any warmth or humanity. In that instant, I realized these weren't the friendly locals they'd pretended to be. They were something else entirely, and I was trapped in their village with no way out. It had all started so innocently. I was backpacking through Europe, living out the dream I'd had since college. 3 months of freedom before I had to return to the real world and start my corporate job. I'd been having the time of my life, hopping from one bustling city to another, soaking in the culture, the history, the sheer aliveness of it all. But after weeks of crowded hostels and tourist-packed attractions, I was craving something different, something off the beaten path. That's when I met Carol and Magda at a small cafe in Prague. They were an older couple, probably in their 60s, with weathered faces and warm smiles. We got to talking, and they told me about their village in the countryside. The way they described it made it sound like paradise. Quaint houses, rolling hills, a simpler way of life untouched by the modern world. "You should visit," Magda said, her eyes twinkling. "We don't get many tourists. It would be a real Czech experience." It sounded perfect, a chance to see the real Czech Republic away from the tourist traps. When they offered me a ride, I didn't hesitate. The drive took several hours, taking us further and further from the city. The landscape changed, becoming more rural, more rugged. We passed through small towns, then nothing but forests and fields. I lost cell service about an hour in, but I wasn't concerned. I was too excited about the adventure ahead. As we drove, Carol and Magda told me stories about their village, Its history, its traditions, they spoke with such pride, such love for their home. It made me even more eager to see it for myself. The sun was setting when we finally arrived. At first glance, it was everything they promised: picturesque houses with red-tiled roofs, a small square with a centuries-old church, chickens pecking in front yards, and the smell of wood smoke in the air. Carol and Magda introduced me to some of the villagers who were out and about. Everyone seemed friendly, welcoming. They invited me to stay in the village's only guest house, a cozy building that looked like it was straight out of a fairy tale. That first night I joined Carol and Magda for dinner at the local pub. The food was hearty and delicious, the beer was excellent, and the atmosphere was lively. Villagers kept coming up to our table, curious about the American visitor. They asked me questions about my travels, about life in the States. I felt like a minor celebrity as the night wore on, and the beer flowed freely. I found myself promising to stay for a few days. Why not? I had the time, and this seemed like the authentic experience I'd been looking for. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed and excited to explore. I spent the day wandering the village, chatting with locals, even helping out with some farm work. Everyone was so friendly, so eager to share their way of life with me. But as the day progressed, I started to notice little things that seemed off. The way conversations would stop abruptly when I approached, the furtive glances some villagers would exchange, and there was something about their smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. I tried to shake off these feelings, telling myself I was just being paranoid. These people had welcomed me with open arms. I was just experiencing culture shock. That's all. That night, there was a festival in the village. Square music, dancing, more of that excellent beer. I let myself get caught up in the festivities, pushing my unease to the back of my mind. It wasn't until I tried to leave that I realized something was very, very wrong. Leave, Carol said, his smile not wavering. But you've only just arrived. You must stay longer. I laughed it off, saying I'd love to, but I had a schedule to keep. That's when I saw it. The flash of something cold and hard in his eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual warm expression. But it sent a chill down my spine. I insist, he said, his hand gripping my arm just a little too tightly. We have so much more to show you. I looked around, suddenly aware of how the villagers had gathered around us. Their faces were still smiling, but their eyes, God, their eyes, they were watching me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I stammered out an excuse and hurried back to the guest house, and my heart pounding. Something was very wrong here, and I needed to get out now. But when I tried to leave the next morning, I found the road out of town blocked. Construction. They said it would be cleared in a day or two, and wasn't I enjoying my stay? Why was I in such a rush to leave? I spent the next few days in a state of increasing panic. Every attempt to leave was thwarted. My phone still had no signal, and I couldn't find a working landline anywhere in the village. The villagers were always around, always watching, always smiling. Those empty smiles. I tried to play along, to pretend everything was fine while I looked for a way out, but it was becoming clear that they knew exactly what I was doing. The pretense of friendliness was wearing thin. It all came to a head on the fifth night. There was another festival, this one different from the others. The villagers wore strange masks and chanted in a language I didn't understand. I watched from my window, terror gripping me as I realized this might be my last chance to escape. I waited until the festival was in full swing, then slipped out the back of the guest house. I had a vague idea of which direction the main road was in. If I could just make it to the forest, maybe I could lose them, find my way to another town. I made it to the edge of the village before I heard the shouts they'd spotted me. I ran, branches whipping my face as I plunged into the darkness of the forest. Behind me, I could hear them coming. Dozens of them, their chants turning to howls that didn't sound entirely human. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but they were always behind me, getting closer. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, calling out to each other in that strange language. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw lights ahead, a highway. I burst out of the tree line, waving my arms frantically at the approaching headlights. The car screeched to a halt, and I practically threw myself at the driver's door. "Please," I gasped, "help me, they're coming." The driver, an older man, took one look at my wild eyes and torn clothes and unlocked the door. I scrambled in just as the first of the villagers emerged from the forest. As we sped away, I looked back. They were standing at the edge of the road watching us go. Even from a distance I could see their eyes gleaming in the darkness. I never found out what they wanted with me, why they were so determined to keep me there. Part of me doesn't want to know. The police didn't believe my story. How could they? It sounded insane, even to me. They found the village, of course, but it was abandoned. No sign of Carol or Magda or any of the others, just empty houses in an old church. Sometimes I wonder if it really happened, if maybe I imagined it all, some kind of nervous breakdown brought on by stress and culture shock. But then I'll catch a glimpse of someone on the street, an older couple perhaps, with weathered faces and warm smiles, and for a moment I'll see those eyes again, cold, empty, hungry, and I'll remember that sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that seem the most welcoming, that evil can wear a friendly face, and that some villages are best left undiscovered. I don't travel much anymore. The world suddenly seems a lot smaller, a lot darker, but sometimes late at night I find myself looking at maps of Eastern Europe, searching for a village that doesn't exist and wondering what might have happened if I'd stayed just one more day. The moment I saw the handwriting on the note, my blood turned to ice. It was the same messy scrawl that had been appearing on our doorstep for weeks, but this time the message wasn't outside. It was on my bedroom mirror, written in what looked horribly like blood. "I see you when you sleep." We'd moved to the old farmhouse 3 months ago. My wife Sarah and I had been dreaming of escaping the city for years when we found this place. 20 acres of land, a charming 19th century house, all for a price that seemed too good to be true. We jumped at the chance. We should have known better. The first few weeks were idyllic. We spent our days fixing up the house, exploring the overgrown fields, and marveling at the silence. No car horns, no sirens, just the wind in the trees and the occasional muff from our neighbors' cows at night. The stars were so bright it took my breath away. But then the notes started appearing. The first one was innocuous enough, a piece of paper tucked under our welcome mat. Nice house. We assumed it was from a neighbor, though the handwriting was odd, jagged, and messy like a child's. A few days later, another note appeared on our porch swing. "You should lock your doors at night." This one gave us pause. We always locked our doors. I double-checked every lock that night, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The notes kept coming, appearing in increasingly impossible places: under a flower pot on our second-story balcony, pinned to a tree at the far end of our property, tucked into the frame of our bedroom window. On the inside, each message was more disturbing than the last. "I like watching you. Your wife looks pretty when she sleeps." Soon we called the police, and of course they came out, took a report, but found nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, no signs of how anyone could have gotten into our locked house. They chalked it up to a prankster told us to install some security cameras. We did more than that. I bought every security device I could find: cameras, motion sensors, alarms on every door and window. I installed floodlights that covered every inch of our property. I even bought a gun, something I'd always been against. But fear has a way of changing your principles. For a while it seemed to work. The note stopped. We started to relax, to think maybe it really had just been kids playing a sick joke. Then came the night. I found the note on our bedroom mirror. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. How had they gotten in? We had alarms, cameras, locks on every entrance. I checked them obsessively before we went to bed, like I did every night. Sarah stirred in her sleep, and I quickly wiped away the message before she could see it. She'd been on the verge of a breakdown over the previous notes. This one would push her over the edge. I spent the rest of the night poring over our security footage, checking every camera, every sensor. Nothing, no sign of intruders, no alarms triggered. It was as if the note had materialized out of thin air. The next morning, I called the police again. This time they took it more seriously. They swept the house, dusted for prints, interviewed our neighbors. Still nothing. "Look," the detective said, his face grave, "I'm going to be straight with you. This level of intrusion, it's not normal. Whoever's doing this They're not just some kid playing pranks. You should consider staying somewhere else for a while. But we had nowhere else to go. We'd sunk every penny we had into this house, and part of me, the part that wasn't consumed by fear, was angry. This was our home. I'd be damned if I let some psycho drive us out of it. So we stayed. I took time off work, spent my days patrolling the property with my gun, jumping at every sound. Sarah was a wreck, barely sleeping, constantly looking over her shoulder. We argued more than we ever had in our 10 years of marriage. The stress eating away at our relationship. The notes kept coming, always in impossible places, inside a locked drawer in the middle of our perfectly made bed, carved into the bark of a tree that I swear hadn't been marked the day before we tried everything. I rigged tripwires, installed more cameras, even sprinkled flour on the floors to catch footprints. Nothing worked. It was as if we were dealing with a ghost. Weeks passed, and the constant fear began to take its toll. I lost weight. Dark circles formed under my eyes from lack of sleep. Sarah started talking about seeing shadows out of the corner of her eye, hearing whispers in empty rooms. I worried she was losing her grip on reality. Hell, I worried I was losing mine. Then came the night that changed everything. I woke up to the sound of Sarah's screaming. I bolted upright, fumbling for the gun I now kept on my nightstand. In the dim light, I saw a figure standing at the foot of our bed, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. I raised the gun, my hand shaking so bad I could barely aim. Get out, I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. Get out, or I'll shoot. The figure turned slowly, and I felt my heart stop. Its face, God, its face, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Pale, almost translucent skin, stretched tight over an elongated skull, eyes that were too big, too black, and its mouth a lipless gash that split its face in a grotesque parody of a smile. I fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. The figure jerked as the bullet hit it, but it didn't fall. Instead, it laughed, a high keening sound that made my skin crawl. Then it was on me, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I felt claws, yes, claws raking across my chest. I screamed, firing wildly, but it was like trying to shoot smoke. Sarah was still screaming, but it sounded far away. Everything was far away except the pain and those terrible black eyes boring into mine. I don't know how long the attack lasted. It felt like hours, but it must have been only moments. Suddenly the weight was gone. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The thing was standing by the window, now silhouetted against the night sky. It turned to look at us one last time, and I swear I saw it smile. Then it was gone, moving so fast it seemed to simply vanish. The police cam, of course, they found the bullet holes in the walls, saw the claw marks on my chest, but they didn't find any other evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to suggest anyone else had been in the room. They think we're crazy that we did this to ourselves, driven mad by stress and paranoia. Maybe they're right. Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier to believe that we didn't stay in the house after that night. Couldn't stay. We packed what we could carry and left the next morning, abandoning everything else. We move around a lot now, never staying in one place for too long. Hotels, motels, short-term rentals, always looking over our shoulders, always waiting for the next note to appear, because they do still appear, not as often but enough to remind us that it's still out there, still watching, still waiting. I don't know what it is, some kind of monster, a demon, a ghost. Does it even matter? All I know is that it's real, and it's not done with us. Sometimes late at night, I think I see a tall, thin shadow outside our window, or catch a glimpse of unnaturally black eyes in a crowd, and I wonder how long we can keep running, how long before it decides to do more than just watch. If you're reading this, take my advice. If you find a house that seems too good to be true, it probably is, and if you start finding notes from someone who can't possibly be there, run, and don't look back. Because some things, once they start watching, you never stop, and you don't want to find out what happens when they decide watching isn't enough anymore. The crunch of leaves under my boots stopped abruptly as I froze, my blood turning to ice there in the clearing where I'd set up camp just hours ago. were fresh footprints that weren't mine. Someone or something had been here while I was gone. And judging by the stillness of the forest around me, they might still be watching. I'd always been an avid solo hiker, priding myself on my ability to navigate the wilderness alone, the solitude, the connection with nature, the sense of self-reliance. It was intoxicating. So when I'd gotten a week off work, I didn't hesitate to pack my gear and head for the Appalachian Trail. I'd hiked sections of it before, but this time I was pushing further, deeper into the remote backcountry. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air filled with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I'd made good time, covering more ground than I'd planned. By the third day, I was well off the main trail in an area so isolated I hadn't seen another soul since yesterday morning. I found the perfect campsite. Just as the sun was setting, a small clearing near a bubbling stream, sheltered by towering pines. I'd set up my tent, gathered firewood, and was just about to start dinner when I realized I'd left my water filter down by the stream. No big deal. I thought it was only a 5-minute walk, but as I approached my campsite on the way back, that feeling of peaceful solitude evaporated in an instant. Something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up before I even consciously processed what I was seeing. Footprints, large ones much bigger than my own, pressed into the soft earth around my tent. They hadn't been there when I left. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, my eyes darting from the footprints to the surrounding forest. The woods suddenly seemed sinister, the lengthening shadows hiding potential threats. I strained my ears, but heard nothing over the pounding of my own heart. Slowly, carefully, I approached my tent. Nothing seemed disturbing at first glance, but then I noticed my backpack. I always left it just inside the tent flap, but now it was sitting outside, slightly unzipped. With shaking hands, I opened it. Further, my breath caught in my throat. My food was gone. Every energy bar, every freeze-dried meal, even the trail mix I'd made myself, all of it vanished. Panic started to set in. I was at least 2 days hike from the nearest town with no food. But that was secondary to the more immediate concern. Whoever had done this could still be nearby. I debated calling for help, but there was no cell service. This far out, I had an emergency beacon. But did this qualify as an emergency? I wasn't hurt, just scared. As darkness fell, I realized I had to make a decision: hike out now in the dark, risking getting lost, or spend the night here knowing someone was out there. In the end, fear of the unknown forest at night outweighed my fear of the mysterious intruder. I decided to stay, but sleep wouldn't come easy. I built up my fire, creating a circle of light that felt pitifully small against the pressing darkness of the forest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept my hiking knife close, though I doubted it would be much use against whatever was out there. As the night wore on, my imagination ran wild. Was it a bear, unusually adept at opening zippers, a desperate hiker stealing food to survive, or something worse? I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke with a start, disoriented. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was pitch black. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why I felt so afraid. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the clearing. I sat up, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. The footsteps stopped. Hello, I called out, my voice embarrassingly weak. Is someone there? Silence, not just quiet, but an absolute absence of sound. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Then a voice, low and grelly, coming from just beyond the ring of fading fir light. You shouldn't be here. I scrambled to my feet, spinning around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. Who's there? What do you want? A chuckle, cold and mirthless. I want you gone. This is my forest. You're trespassing. I'm sorry, I said, hating how my voice trembled. I didn't know. I'll leave first thing in the morning, I swear. Another chuckle, closer this time. Morning? Oh no, you'll leave now. I saw movement in the shadows. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, stepped into the fading circle of light. My breath caught in my throat. It looked wrong, like a man, but stretched out, distorted. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees. Its face was hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but I caught a glint of eyes. Reflecting the firelight. What are you? I whispered. It cocked its head to the side, the movement jerky and unnatural. I'm the guardian of these woods, the protector, the one who keeps people like you out. It took a step closer, and I stumbled back, tripping over a route and falling hard. I scrambled backwards, but it kept coming. Please, I gasped. I'll go, just let me pack up. I'll leave right now. It stopped seeming to consider. No, you'll leave now as you are. Consider your belongings payment for your trespass. I wanted to argue, to insist on at least taking my emergency beacon, but something in its posture, in the way shadows seemed to cling to it, told me arguing would be a very bad idea. I got to my feet, legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. Okay, I'm going. Which way? To the trail, it pointed, a long skeletal finger extending far beyond what should have been possible. That way, 2 miles. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't ever come here again. I nodded, too terrified to speak, and started walking in the direction it had pointed. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but somehow I knew that would be a mistake. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning. In the darkness, I tripped and fell countless times, my hands and knees bloody and raw. But I didn't stop, didn't look back. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, when my legs were about to give out, I saw it, the main trail. I nearly wept with relief as soon as my feet hit the packed earth of the trail. I ran until my lungs burned and spots danced in front of my eyes. I ran until I saw the first signs of civilization. A trail marker, then a parking lot. There was a single car there, an old pickup truck. An elderly man was just getting out, probably planning an early morning hike. He took one look at me, wild-eyed, covered in dirt and blood, wearing only a shirt and shorts despite the cold, and his eyes widened. Good Lord, son, what happened to you? I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? What would he think? In the end, I managed to croak out, got lost, been walking all night. He nodded sympathetically, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. Well, come on then. Let's get you to a hospital. As we drove away, I finally allowed myself to look back at the forest for a moment. Just a moment. I thought I saw a tall, thin figure standing at the tree line, watching us drive away. I've never gone back to those woods, never gone hiking alone again. If I'm honest, some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of that growly voice echoing in my ears. This is my forest, you're trespassing. I don't know what it was I encountered that night, some local legend come to life, a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion, or something else, something that defies explanation. All I know is that sometimes when I look out at the woods behind my house, I catch a glimpse of something tall and thin moving between the trees, and I remember that there are some places in this world where humans are not welcome, where the wilderness is still wild and still has teeth, and I stay inside, lock my doors, and try to forget the night. I learned that some forests are best left unexplored. I should have known better than to pick up a hitchhiker on a night like this. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the lonely stretch of highway into a treacherous mirror of black ice and blurred headlights. But there he was, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched, and I felt a pang of sympathy. After all, I'd been in his shoes once, so I pulled over, my wipers squealing a frantic beat against the windshield. It was my first mistake. The scent hit me before I even got a good look at him, a musty, damp smell that made my nose wrinkle. He slid into the passenger seat with a grunt of thanks, water dripping from his oversized raincoat. Appreciated, he mumbled, his face hidden beneath the coat's hood. Not folks had stop on a night like this. No problem, I replied, trying to sound casual as I pulled back onto the road. Where you headed? Oh, just up the way a bit, he said, vaguely waving a gloved hand. Don't want to be a bother. I'll let you know when to drop me. I nodded, focusing on the road ahead. The rain, if anything, was coming down harder now. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the barren landscape around us. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drumming of rain on the roof. I was starting to relax, a bit when he spoke again, his voice low and growly. So what's your story? I glanced at him, caught off guard by the question. My story, he chuckled, a dry sound that reminded me of rustling leaves. Yeah, your story. What brings you out on a night like this, running to something or from something? I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. There was something about his tone that set me on edge. Just heading home from a business trip, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Of business, he said, nodding slowly. Important stuff, I'm sure. Big decisions, big consequences. I frowned, not liking where this was going. Look, I don't mean to be rude, but I'd rather not discuss my personal life. He held up his hands in a pleading gesture. No offense meant, friend, just making conversation. It's a long, dark road after all. We lapsed back into silence, but the atmosphere in the car had changed. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white after what felt like an eternity. He spoke again. You ever think about the choices we make, how one small decision can change everything? I didn't respond, hoping he'd take the hint and stop talking. No such luck. Take you picking me up, for instance, he continued, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. What if you'd driven past? What if I'd been standing a mile down the road instead? Funny how fate works, isn't it? I suppose, I muttered, desperately wishing I trusted my initial instincts and kept driving. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and in that brief moment of illumination, I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hood. What I saw made my blood run cold. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, but it was his eyes that truly terrified me, black as pitch, with no whites visible at all. They seemed to swallow the light to bottomless pits, staring right through me. I must have made some sound of distress, because he turned to look at me fully, those terrible eyes locking onto mine. Something wrong? He asked, his lips curling into what might have been a smile on a human face. On him it looked like a predator baring its teeth. No, I stammered, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Just thought I saw something on the road. He nodded slowly, that horrific smile still in place. The mind plays tricks, doesn't it? Especially on dark nights like this. Makes you see things that aren't there, or maybe makes you see things as they really are. I was openly sweating now, fear coursing through my veins like ice water. I had to get him out of my car. Consequences be damned. I think this is far enough, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm going to have to drop you off here. He tilted his head, an oddly bird-like motion. Oh, but we've only just started our journey together. There's so much more to discuss. I was about to insist when something caught my eye in the rear view mirror, headlights approaching fast. Relief flooded through me. Another car meant safety, meant I wasn't alone out here with whatever he was. But as the headlights grew closer, I realized something was wrong. They were moving too fast, weaving erratically across the road, and they were aimed straight for us. Look out, I yelled, yanking the wheel hard to the right. Our car skidded on the wet pavement, spinning once, twice before coming to a stop on the shoulder. The other car roared past, horn blaring. For a moment I sat there, hands shaking, gasping for breath. Then I remembered my passenger. I turned to look at him, expecting I don't know what, but the seat was empty. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there. No water on the seat, no lingering musty smell, nothing. I got out of the car on shaky legs, looking up and down the road, but there was no one there, just me, my car, and the endless rain-soaked highway stretching into the darkness. For a long moment I stood there in the rain, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all, some kind of stress-induced hallucination? But deep down I knew that what I'd seen was real, even if I couldn't explain it. And I knew that I'd had a narrow escape from something far more dangerous than a simple car accident. I got back in my car, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I checked into the first motel I saw. I couldn't face the thought of driving through the night again, not with the memory of those black eyes still fresh in my mind as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, about choices and consequences, about fate. What if I hadn't stopped? What if I'd driven past like my instincts had told me to? Would he have found another ride? Or would he still be out there waiting on that dark stretch of road for the next lonely traveler? I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. I don't drive at night, if I can help it, especially when it's raining, and sometimes when I'm on a long empty stretch of road, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a figure standing on the roadside. Thumb outstretched, but I don't stop, I don't even slow down. I just grip the wheel tighter and keep driving, trying to outrun the memory of that night and the realization that came with it that sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones that chase you there, the ones that wait for you to invite them in. And as I drive, I can't help but wonder how many others has he ridden with, how many didn't make it to the end of their journey, and most chillingly of all, was I lucky or was I spared? I don't have answers to these questions, but I do know one thing for certain: if you're ever driving on a dark, rainy night and you see a lone figure on the side of the road, keep driving, no matter how bad you feel, no matter how harmless they might seem. Keep driving and don't look back, because you never know who or what might be looking for a ride. And some passengers, once they get in, never truly leave. The first time I saw the money change hands, I knew I was in over my head. It wasn't much, just a thick envelope passed discreetly between two men in suits, but in that moment, standing in the back of the dusty warehouse we were using as a relief center, I realized this disaster wasn't just about helping people. For some, it was about profit. I'd signed up to volunteer after the flood hit our city. It was the worst natural disaster in decades, leaving thousands homeless and desperate for help. I wanted to do my part to make a difference. Little did I know I was walking into a web of corruption that would threaten my life. The first few days were a blur of activity. I worked tirelessly, distributing food and supplies, helping people find shelter, doing whatever I could to ease the suffering around me. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. I felt like I was making a real impact. It was about a weekend when I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Supplies that were logged as distributed but never seemed to leave the warehouse, donations that came in but weren't recorded, and always men in expensive suits walking around talking in hushed tones. At first I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things, that in the chaos of disaster relief some things were bound to slip through the cracks. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Then came the night I stayed late sorting through a new shipment of medical supplies. I was alone in the warehouse, or so I thought. I heard voices coming from the office in the back, angry whispers that grew louder as I listened. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer, careful to stay hidden behind stacks of boxes. Through the cracked door I could see two men, one I recognized as John, the head of our Lee organization, and the other a city official I'd seen on the news. "This isn't enough," the official was saying, waving an envelope. "Do you know how many strings I had to pull to get those supplies diverted here?" John's face was red with anger. "It's all we can spare right now. You'll get the rest when we sell the next shipment." My blood ran cold. Sell the shipment? These were donations meant for flood victims. How could they be selling them? I must have made a noise, because suddenly both men were looking towards the door. I ducked down, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. "Check outside," I heard Joanne say. "Make sure we're alone." I didn't wait to see if they found me. I ran as quietly as I could back to where I'd been working. I grabbed my bag and headed for the exit, trying to look casual even as panic clawed at my throat. I made it home that night, but sleep was impossible. My mind raced with what I discovered. This wasn't just petty theft or minor corruption. This was organized systemic fraud on a massive scale. And if they were willing to steal from disaster victims, what else were they capable of? The next day, I went back to work, determined to gather evidence. I couldn't just walk away, not when so many people were suffering while these men lined their pockets. I started paying closer attention, making mental notes of discrepancies, even snapping a few discreet photos with my phone. For a week, I played the part of the dutiful volunteer while secretly documenting everything I could. I was careful, or so I thought, but in a place like that with so much at stake, someone is always watching. It was Sarah who warned me first. She was another volunteer, young and idealistic. Like me, we'd become friends over long hours of work. She caught me after our shift, her eyes darting nervously. "Be careful," she whispered. "They're asking questions about you. I think they suspect something." I tried to brush it off to reassure her everything was fine, but inside my stomach churned with fear. That night I decided it was time to go to the authorities. I had enough evidence to at least warrant an investigation. I never got the chance. The next morning I arrived at the warehouse to find it swarming with police. For a moment I felt a surge of hope. Had someone else come forward? Were they finally shutting this operation down? Then I saw John talking to the officers, pointing in my direction. Two policemen approached me, their faces grim. "Man, we need you to come with us," one said. "We have some questions about some missing supplies." I was stunned. They were framing me. How could they have turned this around so quickly? I spent the next 12 hours in a small interrogation room, answering the same questions over and over. They showed me doctor logs with my signature, security camera footage that had been edited to show me taking boxes out to my car. It was all lies, yeah, but it was convincing. If I hadn't lived through it myself, even I might have believed it. They let me go eventually, but the message was clear. They had the power to destroy my life if I didn't back off. I went home that night, feeling defeated and terrified. What could I do against an organization with this much influence? But as I sat in my dark apartment, jumping at every sound, anger began to replace my fear. How dare they steal from people who had lost everything? How dare they turn me into a criminal for trying to do the right thing? I knew I couldn't fight them alone, but maybe I didn't have to. I thought of Sarah, of the other volunteers who must have noticed something was wrong, and I thought of the flood victims, the ones who were suffering because of this corruption. I started reaching out carefully at first. A whispered conversation here, a pointed question there. I found others who had seen things, who had suspicions, but were too afraid to speak up. Together we began to build a case. It wasn't easy. There were close calls, moments when I was sure we'd been discovered. Once I came home to find my apartment had been ransacked. Another time a car followed me for hours as I drove around the city. The fear was constant, a knot in my stomach that never quite went away. But we persevered. We gathered evidence, built a network of witnesses, and finally, after weeks of work, we took our case to the state authorities. The investigation that followed was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Suddenly, I was in meetings with FBI agents, giving depositions, helping to unravel a web of corruption that went far beyond our little relief organization. It turned out the flood had just been the tip of the iceberg. Jan and his associates had been skimming from disaster relief funds for years. All across the country they had politicians in their pockets, judges on their payroll. It was bigger than I could have ever imagined. The day they made the arrest was both triumphant and terrifying. I watched from a safe house as the news showed John and the others being led away in handcuffs, but I knew it wasn't over. People like that, they have long memories and longer reach. I entered witness protection not long after. New name, new city, new life. Sometimes I miss my old life, the friends and family I had to leave behind. But then I think of the people we helped, the lives that were saved because we exposed the truth. It's been 5 years now. I still volunteer. Sometimes at soup kitchens or homeless shelters. I can't help it. The need to make a difference is still there, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the darkness that can lurk behind even the noblest of causes. And sometimes when I see a natural disaster on the news, I wonder, are there others out there right now fighting the same fight I did, risking everything to expose the truth? I hope so, because if my experience taught me anything, it's that corruption thrives in the shadows. It takes brave people willing to shine a light no matter the cost to drive it out. So if you're out there, if you see something wrong, don't stay silent. Speak up, fight back. It won't be easy. It might be the hardest thing you ever do, but it's worth it, because in the end the truth always matters. And who knows, maybe someday, thanks to people like us, there won't be any shadows left for the corrupt to hide. In the moment I stepped into that diner, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with tension, and every eye turned to me with a mix of suspicion, and was that fear I should have turned around right then, gotten back in my car, and driven until this godforsaken stretch of highway was just a bad memory. But I was tired, hungry, and my car was running on fumes, so I stayed. That was my first mistake. I'd been driving for hours, pushing through the night on my way cross-country for a new job. The highway had been empty for miles, nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of my headlights catching a road sign. When I saw the neon glow of the diner sign ahead, it was like an oasis in the desert. Sally's truck stopped. The sign proclaimed in flickering red letters, "Open 24 hours." I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, my tires crunching on gravel. There were only two other vehicles, a beat-up pickup truck and a semi parked off to the side. As I cut the engine, the silence pressed in around me, broken only by the faint buzz of the neon sign. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, the sound oddly cheerful in the tent atmosphere. The diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. Cracked vinyl booths, a scratched Formica counter, faded posters advertising brands that probably didn't exist anymore. There were only a handful of people inside. A weathered-looking trucker sat at the counter, hunched over a mug of coffee. In one booth, a young couple whispered intently to each other, their food untouched, and behind the counter stood a waitress who had to be in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Sit anywhere you like, hun," she called out, her voice strained. Despite the friendly words, I slid into a booth, the vinyl squeaking beneath me. The waitress bustled over, notepad in hand. Up close, I could see the lines of stress etched into her face, the way her eyes darted nervously around the diner. "What'll it be?" she asked, pen poised. "Just coffee for now, thanks," I replied. "And maybe a menu," she nodded, turning away without another word. As she poured my coffee, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. I was just about to ask if everything was okay when the bell above the door jingled again. The atmosphere in the diner, already tense, suddenly became electric. I turned to look and felt my blood run cold. 3 men had entered, all wearing dark clothes and grim expressions. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, surveyed the diner with cold eyes. When his gaze landed on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. They took seats at the counter, and the waitress approached them, her movements stiff and robotic. "Evening, Sally," the scared man said, his voice low and menacing. "A busy night, Sally," apparently the owner as well, as the waitress managed a tight smile. "What kind can I get you boys?" "Oh, I think you know what we want," he replied, leaning in close. "It's the first of the month." After all, I couldn't hear Sally's response, but I saw her nod and disappear into the back. The 3 men turned their attention to the rest of us, their eyes predatory. "Evening, folks," the scared man called out. "Don't mind us, just taking care of a little business." The young couple in the booth huddled closer together, while the trucker at the counter seemed to shrink into himself. I pretended to be engrossed in my menu, but my mind was racing. What had I walked into? Sally returned a few minutes later, carrying a small envelope. She handed it to the scared man, who opened it and began counting the contents. His face darkened. "This isn't enough, Sally," he growled. "We had an agreement." "Business has been slow, Sally," replied her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I need more time." The scared man stood up, suddenly looming over Sally. "We've given you plenty of time. Maybe we need to send a stronger message." One of his companions stood up and moved towards the kitchen. I heard the sound of breaking glass, followed by Sally's cry of distress. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long driving, or the tension in the air, or just a lifetime of watching bullies get away with this kind of thing. Whatever it was, I found myself on my feet before I could think better of it. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding braver than I felt. "Leave her alone." The diner fell silent. The scared man turned to me, his eyes narrowing. Well, he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Looks like we have a hero in our midst." He took a step towards me, and I fought the urge to back away. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. I suggest you sit down and mind your own business." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. You're terrorizing these people. That makes it my business." He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "You have no idea what you're getting into, do you?" Before I could respond, the trucker at the counter suddenly spoke up. "He's right," he said, his voice gravy. "This has gone on long enough." The scared man whirled on him. "You stay out of this, old man." But something had changed. The young couple stood up, moving to stand beside me. Even Sally straightened, a spark of defiance in her eyes. The scared man looked around, suddenly realizing he was outnumbered. His companions shifted uneasily. "You're making a big mistake," he snarled. "All of you will be back, and you'll regret this." With that, they stormed out, the bell jingling angrily as the door slammed behind them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Sally burst into tears, the tension of the moment finally breaking. The trucker went to comfort her, while the young couple sagged against each other in relief. "Thank you," Sally said, wiping her eyes. "You don't know what you've done." Over the next hour, fueled by fresh coffee and slices of Sally's homemade pie, I learned the full story. The three men were part of a local gang that had been extorting businesses along this stretch of highway for years. Nobody had dared stand up to them before, too afraid of retaliation. "But you showed us we can fight back." The trucker, whose name was Bill, said, clapping me on the shoulder. As the night wore on, more people arrived at the diner. Word had spread quickly about what had happened. There was a sense of cautious optimism in the air, a feeling that maybe things could change. When I finally left, the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon. Sally refused to let me pay, insisting my meal was on the house. The young couple, Tom and Sarah, pressed their phone numbers into my hand, telling me to call if I ever passed through again. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Sally in my rearview mirror waving goodbye. I waved back, a lump in my throat. I never did pass through that town again. My new job kept me busy, and life has a way of moving on. But I often think about that night, about Sally and Bill and all the others. I wonder if things really did change, if they managed to break free from the gang's control. Hope they did. I hope that one moment of collective courage was enough to spark a real change, because that's the thing about standing up to bullies. Sometimes all it takes is one person to be brave, and others will find their courage too. And sometimes on long drives late at night, I'll see a diner glowing in the distance. I'll think about pulling over, about walking into another moment that might change everything. I never do, of course. Lightning doesn't strike twice, as they say, but I smile, remembering that night, remembering that sometimes the most extraordinary things can happen in the most ordinary places. And I drive on, carrying with me the memory of the night I stumbled into a small town drama and just maybe helped change the course of history, even if it was just the history of one little diner on a lonely stretch of highway. The first time I saw my new neighbors, I thought they were the perfect addition to our quiet suburban street. The Andersons, Mike, Sarah, and their little girl seemed like they'd stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting. But as I stand here now, barricaded in my bedroom, while Mike tries to break down the door, I realize how terribly wrong I was. Perfection, it turns out, can hide the darkest of secrets. It all started 3 months ago. I'd just gone through a messy divorce and was trying to piece my life back together in the house I'd fought so hard to keep. The moving truck pulled up next door on a sunny Saturday morning, and I watched from behind my curtains as the Andersons unloaded their life into the house that had stood empty for nearly a year. Mike was tall and handsome, with a friendly smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Sarah was petite and pretty, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and little Emma, no more than 5 or 6, skipped along behind them, clutching a stuffed rabbit. I'll admit I was envious. They looked like the family I'd always wanted, but never ever managed to have. Still, I decided to be neighborly. I baked a batch of chocolate chip cookies and walked over to introduce myself. Sarah answered the door, her smile warm and welcoming. "Oh, how thoughtful," she exclaimed, accepting the cookies. "Mike and Emma, come meet our new neighbor." They gathered at the door, the perfect family portrait. Mike shook my hand firmly. "It's great to meet you," he said. "We're looking forward to becoming part of the community." Emma peeked out from behind her mother's legs, shy but curious. I knelt down to her, level. "Hi there, Emma, I like your rabbit." "Does he have a name?" She nodded solemnly. "Mr. Flopsy," she whispered. I couldn't help but smile. They seemed so normal, so nice. How could I have known what lay beneath the surface? Over the next few weeks, the Andersons integrated seamlessly into the neighborhood. Sarah joined the local book club. Mike volunteered to coach the Little League team. They hosted a backyard barbecue that the whole street attended. Everyone loved them. I found myself spending more and more time with Sarah. She'd invite me over for coffee in the mornings after Mike left for work and Emma was at school. We'd sit in her immaculate kitchen gossiping and laughing like old friends. "I'm so glad we moved here," Sarah confided one morning, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "It's just what we needed after everything." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh, did something happen at your old place?" A shadow passed over her face so quickly I almost missed it. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes you just need a fresh start." I nodded, not wanting to pry. We all had our secrets after all, but as the weeks went on, I started noticing things, little things at first easily explained away. The way Sarah would flinch if Mike moved too suddenly, the times I'd hear raised voices from next door late at night, how Emma seemed to grow quieter, more withdrawn. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, projecting my own failed marriage onto their seemingly perfect one, but the signs kept piling up. One afternoon I was in my garden when I heard a crash from the Andersons' house, followed by Sarah's muffled cry. I froze, trowel in hand, listening intently. There was silence for a moment. Then the sound of Mike's voice, too low for me to make out the words. Sarah didn't make another sound. I debated with myself for a long time that night. Should I say something, do something? But what if I was wrong? What if I ruined this family over a misunderstanding? In the end, I decided to talk to Sarah. I invited her over for coffee the next morning, determined to broach the subject gently. She showed up with a bruise on her cheek, poorly concealed by makeup. "Sarah," I said softly, "what happened?" She touched her cheek self-consciously. "Oh, this, I'm such a klutz." Walked right into the kitchen cabinet. I took a deep breath. "Sarah, I heard something yesterday. Are you sure everything's okay?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear passing through them before her expression smoothed out. "Of course," she said, her voice overly bright. "Everything's fine. Mike and I, we're very happy." I wanted to push further, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't ready to talk. I couldn't force her. After that, things changed. Sarah stopped inviting me over when we passed on the street. Her smile seemed strained, and Mike started watching me. I'd catch him staring from across the street, his eyes cold and calculating. I knew I should have done something then, called the police or a domestic violence hotline, something. But I was a coward. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I could be misreading the situation. Until the night I heard Emma screaming. It was past midnight. I'd been having trouble sleeping and was sitting by my bedroom window when I heard it, a child's terrified shriek, quickly muffled. I was out of my house and pounding on their door. Before I even realized what I was doing, Mike answered, his hair-mussed eyes blazing with barely contained rage. "What?" he snarled. "I heard. Is Emma okay?" I stammered. His expression shifted, a mask of concern sliding into place. "Emma had a nightmare," he said smoothly. "Everything's fine. Go home." But over his shoulder I saw Sarah. Her eye was swollen shut, blood trickling from her split lip. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw a desperate plea in her gaze. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice shaking. Mike's facade cracked. "You're not calling anyone," he growled, advancing on me. I turned to run, but he was faster. His hand closed around my arm, yanking me into the house. The door slammed shut behind us. What followed was a nightmare. Mike rage alternating between threats and attempts to convince me I was imagining things. Sarah huddled in the corner, cradling Emma, both of them trembling. I managed to break free, to lock myself in the guest bedroom. I fumbled for my phone, thanking God I'd slipped it into my robe pocket. The 911 operator's voice was calm, reassuring. "Help was on the way," she said. "Just hold on." But Mike was at the door now, pounding Screaming, the wood was beginning to splinter, and so here I am waiting, praying. The blue and red lights are flashing outside. Now I can see them through the window, but will they get here in time? The door gives way with a final terrible crack. Mike bursts in, his eyes wild, a kitchen knife clutched in his hand. Time seems to slow down. I see the knife arcing towards me. I hear Sarah screaming from somewhere in the house. And then suddenly there are more voices. Shouts of police freeze. Mike's expression changes, confusion replacing rage. The knife clatters to the floor, and then he's on the ground. Officers swarming over him. The next few hours pass in a blur. Statements are taken. Sarah and Emma are LED out, wrapped in blankets to waiting ambulances. Mike is put into the back of a police car, his face a mask of cold fury as he stares at me through the window. As dawn breaks, a kind FOC officer approaches me. You did the right thing, she says gently. You probably saved their lives. But as I watch Sarah and Emma drive away, as I think about the months of abuse I suspected but did nothing about, I don't feel like a hero. I feel like I should have done more sooner. The officer must see something in my expression. Hey, she says, don't blame yourself. The important thing is you acted when it mattered most. I nod, but the guilt still gnaws at me. As I walk back to my house, I realized nothing will ever never be the same. The illusion of suburban tranquility has been shattered. In the coming days, I learn more about the Anderson past, the previous towns they'd fled from, the trail of suspicion and fear they'd left behind. I wonder how many other neighbors had seen the signs and looked away. Sarah and Emma don't come back to the house. I hear they've gone to stay with Sarah's sister in another state. I hope they find peace, find a way to heal us. For me, I'm left with the knowledge that evil can hide behind the most normal of facades, that sometimes being a good neighbor means being willing to step in to risk everything to help someone in need. The house next door stands empty now, a silent reminder of the secrets it once held. And every night I find myself watching, wondering about the lives being lived behind closed doors all around me, wondering if I'll have the courage to act if I ever hear another scream in the night. The moment I saw the glint of metal in his hand, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just another house showing gone wrong. This was a trap, and I'd walked right into it. As the man's cold eyes locked onto mine, I realized with horrifying clarity that I might not make it out of this empty house alive. It had started like any other day in my life as a real estate agent. I'd been in the business for over a decade, and while I'd had my share of odd clients and creepy houses, nothing had prepared me for what was about to unfold. The call came in just as I was about to head home for the day. A man, his voice growly and impatient, insisted on seeing a property immediately. It was a bit unusual, sure, but not unheard of. Sometimes serious buyers operated on tight schedules, and in this market you didn't turn down potential sales. I understand it's late, he said, but I'm only in town for the night. I'm very interested in the property on Elm Street, the old Victorian. I'd make it worth your while. I hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky outside my office window. It was already past 7:00 p.m., and the house in question was on the outskirts of town, Breeze, in a rather isolated area. But the promise of a hefty commission overrode my initial reluctance. All right, I agreed, I can meet you there in about 30 minutes. Is that okay? Perfect, he replied, a hint of something I couldn't quite identify in his tone. I'll see you then. As I drove to the property, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The old Victorian house on Elm Street had been on the market for months. It was a beautiful property, but its remote location and the persistent rumors that it was haunted had scared off most potential buyers. I'd shown it a few times during the day, but never at night. I pulled up to the house just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. The Victorian loomed before me, its windows dark and empty, like soulless eyes staring down at me. I suppressed a shiver as I got out of my car. There was no other vehicle in sight. I checked my watch. I was right on time. Perhaps the client was running late. I decided to wait by the front door, keys in hand. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I was just about to call it quits when a figure emerged from the shadows. At the side of the house he was tall, dressed all in black, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. "Mr. Johnson," I called out, remembering the name he'd given on the phone. He nodded, stepping closer. "Sorry I'm late, I was just admiring the ground." Something about his voice had changed. It was softer now, almost gentle, but with an undercurrent that set my nerves on edge. But I pushed the feeling aside. After all, this was just another client, just another showing, and I forced a smile and turned to unlock the door. "Well, shall we begin the tour?" The house was even creepier on the inside. Our footsteps echoed in the empty rooms, and shadows danced on the walls. In the beam of my flashlight, I began my usual spiel about the property's features, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. Mr. Johnson followed silently behind me, showing little reaction to anything I said. His lack of questions or comments was unusual, but I chalked it up to the late hour and pressed on with the tour. It wasn't until we reached the master bedroom on the second floor that things took a turn. I was midway through describing the original hardwood floors when I realized Miss Johnson was no longer behind me. I turned my flashlight beam sweeping across the room and found him standing by the door that was now closed. "Miss Johnson," I said, unable to keep the tremor out of my voice, "is everything all right?" He smiled, then a cold, mirthless expression that turned my blood to ice. "Oh yes, everything is just fine, but I'm afraid there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. You see, I'm not here to buy this house." My heart began to race. "I don't understand. Why are we here?" Then he took a step towards me, and that's when I saw it, the metallic glint of a knife in his hand. "We're here because this is where it needs to happen, where you need to disappear." Terror gripped me as the full reality of my situation sank in. I was alone in an empty house with a madman, and no one knew where I was. I'd walked right into his trap. My mind raced, searching for a way out. The window, too high and likely painted shut. In this old house, the door, he was blocking it. I began to back away, my eyes never leaving the knife. "Please," I stammered, "you don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone, just let me go." He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the empty room. "Oh, I'm afraid I do have to do this. You see, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. It's nothing personal, really. You're just convenient." As he spoke, he advanced slowly, like a predator toying with its prey. I kept backing up until I felt the cold wall behind me. I was cornered in that moment. As I stared into the eyes of a killer, my life didn't flash before my eyes like they say it does. Instead, my mind filled with regrets. Regrets for not trusting my instincts, for coming to this godforsaken house alone at night, for being so driven by the prospect of a sale that I ignored all the warning signs. But beneath the regret and the fear, a spark of defiance ignited. I didn't want to die, not here, not like this. As he raised the knife, time seemed to slow down. I saw an opening, and I took it. I lunged forward, my shoulder connecting with his chest. The move caught him off guard, and he stumbled backward. I heard the knife clatter to the floor as I pushed past him, yanking open the door and running for my life. My feet pounded down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy, his breathing labored. I reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, panic making my fingers clumsy. Just as I managed to wrench the door open, I felt his hand close around my arm. I screamed, the sound piercing the quiet night air, and fought with everything I had. My elbow connected with something soft, his stomach, maybe in his grip, loosened just enough for me to break free. I ran into the night, not daring to look back. My car was just a few yards away, a beacon of safety in the darkness. I reached at my hand, shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. As I finally wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, standing on the porch watching me. I peeled out of the driveway, gravel spitting from under my tires. I didn't slow down until I reached the police station, my heart still pounding, tears streaming down my face. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and crime scene investigations. They found evidence in the house, hidden rooms, tools of torture, trophies from other victims. Mr. John's son, whose real name turned out to be Gerald Hoffman, had been using empty houses as his killing grounds for years. He preyed on real estate agents, luring them to remote properties and murdering them. They caught him 2 weeks later, trying to pull the same trick in another town. When they showed me his photo to identify him, I felt a chill run down my spine. The face that had haunted my nightmares was now locked away, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. I quit my job as a real estate agent. Soon after, I couldn't bear the thought of walking into another empty house, of being alone with a stranger in a remote location. The career I had built over a decade was gone, destroyed in a single night of terror. But as I sit here now, safe in my new home in a bustling city neighborhood, I know I made the right choice. I'm one of the lucky ones. I survived, and every day I'm grateful for that second chance. Sometimes when I pass a for sale sign or see a real estate agent leading clients into a house, I'm tempted to warn them, to tell them about the dangers that can lurk behind closed doors, about the predators who use our trust against us. But I know most wouldn't believe me. After all, who expects a simple house showing to turn into a fight for survival? So instead, I've become an advocate for safety in the real estate industry. I speak at conferences, write articles, anything I can do to spread awareness, because while my story had a lucky ending, I know there are others out there who weren't so fortunate. And if I can prevent even one more person from walking into the trap I narrowly escaped, then maybe, just maybe, some good can come from that terrifying night. The first twig snap could have been anything: a deer, a raccoon, the wind. But the second one, followed by the unmistakable sound of hushed voices, sent a chill down my spine. We weren't alone in these woods, and whoever was out there wasn't here for a friendly campfire chat. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mike and Lisa, escaping the city for a few days of peace and quiet. In the mountains, we found this little cabin on some obscure rental site, remote, rustic, and far from the usual tourist trails. Perfect, we thought, for getting away from it all. The drive up had been full of laughter and excitement. We'd stopped at a small general store in the last town before the turnoff, stocking up on supplies and chatting with the old man behind the counter. He'd given us an odd look when we told him where we were staying. Folks don't go up that way much anymore, he said, his weathered face creasing with concern. Not since. Well, never mind, you all be careful now. You hear here? We brushed it off as small town superstition. If only we'd listened. The cabin was everything the listing had promised: a cozy 2-bedroom nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. We'd spent the first day hiking, exploring the nearby trails, and marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. As night fell, we gathered around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was the first to notice it, a feeling of being watched that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild after one too many of Mike's horror stories, but I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on us, hidden somewhere in the darkness beyond our little circle of firelight. Hey, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Does anyone else feel like I don't know, like we're being watched? Sarah laughed, but it sounded forced. Don't tell me Mike's stories are getting to you too. But I saw the way her eyes darted to the tree line, the tension in her shoulders. She felt it too. Mike stood up, puffing out his chest in an exaggerated show of bravery. All right, who's out there? Come on out, you big scary monster. His shout echoed through the trees, answered only by the crackle of our fire and the distant hoot of an owl. For a moment we all held our breath, waiting. Then Lisa screamed. We all whirled to look where she was pointing. There, just at the edge of the fir light, stood a figure, tall, unnaturally still, its features hidden in shadow. For a heartbeat nobody moved. Then the figure turned and melted back into the darkness of the forest. Panic erupted. Lisa was sobbing, clinging to Mike. Sarah had grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. What the hell was that? Mike's voice was high, all pretense of bravery gone. I don't know, I said, my mouth dry, but I think we should get inside now. We doused the fire and hurried into the cabin, locking the door behind us. Sleep was out of the question. We huddled in the living room, jumping at every creak of the old wooden structure. every whisper of wind through the trees. Outside, maybe it was just a hiker, Sarah suggested, her voice trembling, someone who got lost and was attracted by our fire. Then why didn't they say anything? Lisa countered, why just stand there? Nobody had an answer for that. As dawn broke, we began to relax a little. Things always seem less scary in the light of day. We convinced ourselves we'd overreacted, that lack of sleep and too many scary stories had played tricks on our minds. But when Mike went outside to get some firewood, he came running back, in his face pale. The car, he gasped. Someone slashed the tires. We ran out to look. Sure enough, all 4 tires were flat, deep gashes in the rubber. This was no accident, no random act of vandalism. This was deliberate. We need to get out of here, Sarah said, her voice shaking. We need to call for help. But when I pulled out my phone, there was no signal. None of us had service. Okay, I said, trying to stay calm. Okay, we can handle this. The general store, it's what, 10 mil back down the road. We can walk it in a few hours. Nobody looked thrilled at the idea of a long hike, but it was our only option. We packed some supplies and set out to the morning sun, doing little to warm the chill of fear that had settled over us. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we heard it, the snap of a twig behind us. We all froze, slowly turning to look. Nothing, just trees and underbrush. But I could have sworn I saw a movement just for a second, like something ducking behind a tree. We need to move faster, I said, my voice low and urgent. We picked up the pace, no longer talking, each of us straining our ears for any sound of pursuit. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful and peaceful just yesterday, now felt oppressive, full of hidden dangers. It was Sarah who spotted the cabin just off the trail, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It wasn't our rental. This one was older, more rundown, but it was shelter, and right now that's all we cared about. We approached cautiously. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside it was dark and musty, years of neglect evident in the thick layer of dust covering everything. Hello, I called out. Is anyone here? Silence answered me. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. It looked like no one had been here in years. Old furniture was covered in sheets, cobwebs hung in every corner. Look, Mike said, pointing to a faded photo on the wall. Isn't that the old man from the general store? We crowded around the picture. It showed a group of men standing in front of this very cabin, all holding rifles and smiling. The old shopkeeper was there, decades younger but unmistakable. And next to him, oh my God, Lisa whispered, the figure on the end didn't quite fit with the others, taller, its features blurred as if it had moved when the photo was taken. But there was no mistaking that unnaturally long, thin silhouette. A floorboard creaked behind us. We spun around to find the old shopkeeper standing in the doorway, a shotgun in his hands. You folks shouldn't be here, he said, his voice grave. It's not safe. For a moment nobody spoke, then the questions came pouring out. Who was following us? What was in that photo? What the hell was going on? The old man sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. It's a long story, he said, and you're not going to like it. He told us about the town's dark history, about the cult that had once lived in these woods, practicing dark rituals and sacrificing outsiders to their twisted god. How the townspeople had finally banded together to drive them out, burning their compounds and killing any cultist they could find but their leader. The old man said, his eyes distant with memory. He was something else, not quite human anymore. If he ever was, we couldn't kill him. No matter what we did, so we trapped him, bound him to these woods with blood and magic. He gestured to the photo that was taken the day after we thought it was over. But every few years, someone comes up here, someone who doesn't know the history, and he hunts them, torments them, tries to use their fear, their pain, to break free of his binding. We listened in horrified silence. It sounded insane, impossible, but after what we'd seen, could we really discount it? So, what do we do? I asked, my voice hoarse. The old man's face hardened. We get you out of these woods, and then we make sure no one else comes up here again. What followed was the most terrifying trek of my life. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. The old man led the way, his shotgun at the ready, constantly scanning the trees around us. We were almost to the road when we heard it, a sound like nothing I've ever heard before or since, a howl, but not animal, not human. It echoed through the trees, filled with rage and hunger. And something alien. Run, the old man yelled. We ran. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tried to trip us. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind us, getting closer. We burst out onto the road just as a truck came around the bend. The old man fired his shotgun into the air, and the truck screeched to a halt. Get in, he shouted at us. Go now. We piled into the truck bed as it peeled away. I caught one last glimpse of the woods. There, just at the tree line, stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its arms too long, its face a blur of features. It raised one elongated hand as if farewell. Then the truck rounded a curve, and it was gone. We never went back to those woods. The old man made sure the cabin rental was taken down the road, blocked off. He said he'd make sure no one else wandered into that thing's territory. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that howl in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those woods, that figure still fresh in my mind. And I'd wonder, is it still out there waiting? And what happens when the old man is gone, and there's no one left to keep people away? I pray I never have to find out. The sound of breaking glass shattered the eerie quiet of the empty bar. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, dish towel still in hand, to face the group of men who refused to leave. Their eyes gleamed with malicious intent in the dim light, and I knew in that moment that this shift was about to become a fight for survival. I'd been working at Al's for about 6 months. It wasn't glamorous, but the late night bartending gig paid well enough to cover my college tuition. Most nights were uneventful, a few regulars nursing their beers, maybe the occasional rowdy group that needed to be gently encouraged to head home. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It started like any other Tuesday. The usual crowd had trickled in and out, leaving behind a mess of empty glasses and peanut shells. By 1:00 a.m. the place was empty save for a group of 5 men huddled in a corner booth. They'd been there for hours, getting progressively louder and more belligerent with each round. I'd already cut them off an hour ago, much to their vocal displeasure now, as I wiped down the bar and counted down the minutes until closing time. I could feel their eyes on me. The weight of their stares made my skin crawl. All right, gentlemen, I called out, forcing a cheerful tone. It's last call, time to settle up and head out. The largest of the group, a burly man with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos, stood up. He swayed slightly, steadying himself on the table. We ain't going nowhere, sweetheart. He slurred the parts. Just getting started. I felt a chill run down my spine, but kept my voice firm. I'm sorry, but we're closed. I'm going to have to insist you leave. That's when he picked up his empty beer bottle and hurled it against the wall. The crash seemed to echo in the silent bar, punctuated by the man's harsh laughter. What you going to do about it, little girl? He taunted. His friends joined in their laughter, a chorus of menace. I reached for my phone, intending to call the police, but the tattooed man was quicker. He vaulted over the bar with surprising agility for someone so intoxicated, knocking the phone from my hand. It skittered across the floor, disappearing under a table. Now, he said, his breath hot on my face. Let's not involve the cops. This is between us. I backed away, my heart pounding. The other men were spreading out, blocking the exits. I was trapped. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice ready, take whatever's in the till. I won't stop you, just please leave. The man chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. Oh, we'll take the money, but that's not all we want. His intentions were clear in his leering gaze. Panic surged through me, but with it came a rush of adrenaline. I wasn't going down without a fight. I grabbed the first thing my hand touched, a bottle of expensive whiskey, and swung it with all my might. It connected with the side of the man's head with a satisfying. He staggered back, more surprised than hurt, but it gave me the opening I needed. I vaulted over the bar, narrowly avoiding the grasping hands of one of his friends. My mind raced, searching for a way out. The front door was blocked, but there was a back exit through the kitchen. If I could just reach it. I sprinted towards the kitchen, dodging tables and chairs behind me. I could hear the men shouting Their heavy footsteps giving chase. I burst through the swinging doors into the kitchen, my eyes frantically scanning for a weapon. My hand closed around the handle of a heavy cast iron skillet. Just as the first man entered the kitchen, I swung without hesitation, the pan connecting with his face. With a sickening crunch, he went down hard, but there was no time to feel relieved. The others were right behind him. I backed up, wielding the skillet like a shield. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice sounding braver than I felt. The tattooed man appeared in the doorway, blood trickling from where the whiskey bottle had struck him. His eyes were cold with rage. "You're going to pay for that," he snarled. He lunged at me, but his movements were slowed by alcohol and anger. I sidestepped, bringing the skillet down on his outstretched arm. He howled in pain, stumbling into a rack of pots and pans. The resulting crash was deafening. In the confined space, I used the distraction to make a break for the back door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, precious seconds ticking by as I struggled to open it. Just as I felt the bolt slide free, a hand grabbed my hair, yanking me backward. I cried out in pain as I was spun around, coming face to face with one of the other men. His breath reeked of alcohol as he leered at me. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered. In that moment, something in me snapped. All the fear, all the anger, it crystallized into a white-hot fury. I brought my knee up hard, connecting solidly with his groin as he doubled over. I smashed the skillet into the side of his head. He crumpled to the floor. Unmoving, the back door burst open, cool night air rushing in. For a split second, I thought it was my salvation. Then two more men entered, blocking my escape out. I was outnumbered and cornered, but I wasn't giving up. I brandished the skillet, my eyes darting between the newcomers and the tattooed man who was struggling to his feet. "I don't want to hurt anyone else," I said, my voice shaking. "Just let me go." The tattooed man laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Oh, you've done it. Now, girl, we were just going to have some fun, but now we're going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget." They began to close in, forming a half circle around me. I backed up until I felt the cold metal of the industrial refrigerator against my back. This was it. I was out of options, out of space, just as I was preparing for a final desperate stand. The kitchen was suddenly flooded with light. We all froze, blinking in the sudden brightness. "Police, nobody move." I'd never been so relieved to hear those words in my life. The kitchen was suddenly swarming with officers, their guns drawn. The men were quickly subdued, handcuffed, and led away. As the adrenaline began to fade, I felt my legs give out. I slid down the fridge, sitting heavily on the floor. A female officer knelt beside me, her face etched with concern. "Are you all right, miss?" she asked. Gently, I nodded, not trusting my voice. She helped me to my feet and led me out of the kitchen. The bar was now bustling with activity, officers taking statements, paramedics tending to the injured men. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I'd faced down 5 violent men and survived, more than survived, I'd fought back. The next few weeks were a blur of police statements and court appearances. The men were charged with attempted assault, among other things. Their records showed a history of similar incidents. I'd likely save future victims by standing up to them. I didn't go back to bartending after that night. The owner of Ambiance understood, even offered to help me find a day job, but the experience had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I enrolled in self-defense classes, then branched out into various martial arts. I found a strength in myself I never knew I had. Eventually, I started teaching other women how to protect themselves, how to find their own inner strength. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the sound of that bottle smashing against the wall. I still feel the terror of being cornered, outnumbered, but those memories no longer paralyze me. Instead, they remind me of what I'm capable of when pushed to my limits. That night in the bar was the worst experience of my life, but it was also the night I discovered my true strength. And for that, in a strange way, I'm almost grateful now. When I look in the mirror, I don't see a victim. I see a survivor, a fighter. And I know that no matter what life throws at me, I have the strength to face it head. On the moment I heard the first twig snap, I knew I wasn't alone. The forest which had seemed so peaceful just moments ago, suddenly felt sinister as darkness fell and unfamiliar voices echoed through the trees. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't just lost, I was being hunted. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. I'd done it 100 times before in different parks across the country. Wake up early, drive to the trailhead, spend the day surrounded by nature, and be back in time for dinner. But this time something went terribly wrong. I'd chosen a new trail, one I'd read about online. It promised stunning views and a challenging climb, perfect for testing my skills. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and wild flowers. I passed a few other hikers early on, exchanging friendly nods, but as I climbed higher, the trail became more isolated. By early afternoon, I reached the summit. The view was breathtaking, miles of unbroken forest stretching to the horizon, painted in 1,000 shades of green. I sat on a rocky outcrop, munching on my packed lunch and feeling on top of the world. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of heading back the way I came, I decided to take a different trail down. It looked easier on my map, a gentler slope that would be kinder on my knees. I didn't realize then how that simple decision would change everything. As at first the new trail seemed fine, a bit overgrown perhaps, but still clearly marked. But as I descended, things started to feel off. The markers became fewer and farther between. The path narrowed, sometimes disappearing entirely under thick underbrush. More than once I had to backtrack after reaching dead ends. As the hours wore on, a sick feeling grew in my stomach. I should have reached the bottom by now. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use GPS to find my way, only to find there was no signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest cell tower. Panic started to set in. I was lost, alone in an unfamiliar forest with night approaching. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I had supplies, water, some energy bars, a flashlight. I could make it through the night if I had to. In the morning, I'd find my way out. I just needed to keep a level head. That's when I heard it, a voice, distant but clear, calling out, "Hello, is someone there?" Relief washed over me. Other hikers, they must be lost too. Maybe together we could find our way back. "Hey," I shouted back, "I'm over here." I'm lost. Silence for a moment, then another voice, closer this time. "We hear you. Stay where you are. We're coming." I waited, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The voices grew closer, and I could hear the sound of people moving through the underbrush. But as they approached, something felt wrong. The way they were calling to each other, it didn't sound like lost hikers. It sounded like they were coordinating, almost like a hunt. Ice ran through my veins as I realized my mistake. These weren't rescuers. They weren't even fellow hikers. They were something else entirely, and I had just given away my position. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming for me. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the forest. I could hear them behind me now, no longer bothering to hide. Their pursuit shouts echoed through the trees, getting closer. No matter how fast I ran, she went this way. Don't let her reach the river. Spread out, cut her off. River? What river? I hadn't seen any river on my map, but right now a river sounded like salvation. If I could reach, maybe I could follow it downstream. Find help. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, heart pounding in my ears. The light was fading fast. Now the forest around me, turning into a maze of shadows. More than once I stumbled, barely catching myself before I fell. And still they came, always behind me, always getting closer. Just when I thought I couldn't run another step, I heard it, the faint sound of rushing water. The river. I pushed myself harder, hope giving me a final burst of speed. I burst out of the tree line onto a rocky bank. The river stretched before me, wide and fast, flowing too wide to cross safely, especially in the growing darkness. But it was my only chance. I was about to plunge, and when a voice rang out, closer than ever, "Stop right there." I spun around. A man emerged from the trees, then another and another. Soon I was surrounded by a group of men, all dressed in dark clothing, all carrying were those guns. Well, one of them said, stepping forward. He seemed to be the leader, older than the others, with a face weathered by years in the outdoors. "Looks like we caught ourselves A lost little lamb. Please, I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. I'm just a hiker. I got lost. I don't want any trouble. The man laughed, a cold sound that sent chills down my spine. Oh, you're in trouble, all right. You see, these are our woods, and we don't take kindly to trespassers. I didn't know, I said, my mind racing. I'll leave, just let me go, and I'll never come back. He shook his head, a cruel smile playing on his lips. I'm afraid it's not that simple, you see. We have a tradition in these parts, a way of dealing with folks who wander where they don't belong. The other men were closing in now, forming a tight circle around me. I could see the excitement in their eyes, the anticipation. This was a game to them, and I was the prey. What do you want from me? I asked, hating how my voice trembled. The leader smile widened. We're going to give you a sporting chance, a head start, if you will. You run, and we hunt. If you can make it out of these woods by sunrise, you're free to go. If not, he left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. I looked around, desperately searching for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The men blocked the way back into the forest, and behind me was the river, too wide, too fast, too dangerous. You have 1 minute, the leader said, checking his watch. I suggest you make it count. For a moment I stood frozen, unable to believe this was happening. Then survival instinct kicked in. I turned and ran, not towards the forest, where they could easily track me, but along the riverbank. If I could just find a narrower spot, maybe a bridge behind me. I heard the leader's voice calling out like this was some sort of demented party game. Ready or not, here we come. I ran like I'd never run before. The rocky bank was treacherous in the darkness, and more than once I nearly pitched into the rushing water. But fear drove me on, the sound of pursuit spurring me to impossible speeds. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the darkness, measured only by the pounding of my heart and the ragged gasps of my breathing. Sometimes I thought I heard them right behind me. Other times the forest seemed eerily silent. As I rounded a bend in the river, I saw it, a fallen tree creating a makeshift bridge across the water. It was risky, the trunk slick with moss and spray from the river, but it was my only chance. I scrambled onto the log, inching my way across. The river roared beneath me, ready to sweep me away. If I made one wrong move, I was halfway across when I heard shouts from the bank. They'd found me. A gunshot rang out, splintering the wood near my feet. I froze for a second, then forced myself to keep moving. Another shot, closer. This time they were trying to scare me, to make me fall. With a final desperate lunge, I made it to the other side. I allowed myself one glance back. The men were gathered on the opposite bank, the leader watching me with a mixture of anger and grudging respect. This isn't over, he shouted over the roar of the river. These woods go on for miles. You'll never make it out by sunrise. But I was already running again, plunging into the unknown forest on this side of the river. He was right. I had no idea where I was, no idea if I was even running in the right direction. But I had to try. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I ran until I couldn't run any more, then walked, then crawled. Every sound made me jump, certain they had somehow crossed the river and found me. Again, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally broke through the tree line. A road stretched before me, empty in the early morning light. I wanted to cry with relief. A car appeared in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, probably looking like a mad woman. The car slowed, then stopped. An old man peered out at me, concern etched on his face. Are you all right, miss? He asked. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd been through? In the end, I simply shook my head. Let's get you to the hospital, he said, gently opening the passenger door. As we drove away, I watched the forest recede in the side mirror. Somewhere in those woods, a group of men were probably realizing their prey had escaped. I shuddered, wondering how many others hadn't been so lucky. I never went hiking alone again after that night. But sometimes when I see a trailhead leading into dense woods, I think about those men, and I wonder if they're still out there waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to stumble into their twisted game. The moment I saw the gleam in the old woman's eyes as she locked the bedroom door, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just a quaint bed. and breakfast run by an eccentric couple. It was a trap, and we had walked right into it. It all started as a spontaneous weekend getaway. My girlfriend Lisa and I had been dating for about a year, and we decided to celebrate our anniversary with a trip to the countryside. We wanted something different from the usual tourist spots, so when we stumbled upon an ad for a charming bed and breakfast nestled in the rolling hills of a remote valley, it seemed perfect. The place was called Willow Creek Inn, and the website showed pictures of a Victorian-style house surrounded by lush gardens. The rates were surprisingly affordable, and the reviews, though few, were glowing. We booked it without a second thought. The drive out was beautiful. We left the city behind, watching as towering skyscrapers gave way to farmland and then dense forests. As we wound our way deeper into the valley, I couldn't shake a growing sense of isolation. We hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and our cell phones had lost signal miles back. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Lisa asked, peering at the handwritten directions we printed out. I nodded, though I was starting to have doubts myself. The website said it was pretty remote, part of the charm. Right just as we were considering turning back, we rounded a bend, and there it was, Willow Creek. It looked exactly like the photos, a grand old house with a wide porch surrounded by willows. It was like stepping back in time. An elderly couple emerged from the front door as we pulled up. They introduced themselves as George and Martha, the owners. They were the picture of small-town hospitality, all warm smiles and folksy charm. "We're so glad you found us," Martha said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We don't get many visitors these days." George grabbed our bags before I could protest. "Surprisingly spree for a man his age. Let's get you two lovebirds settled in," he said with a wink. The inside of the inn was like a museum. Antique furniture, faded photographs on the walls, even an old gramophone in the corner. It was fascinating, but something about it made me uneasy. It felt less like a living space and more like a perfectly preserved moment in time. Our room was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway. George set our bags down, and Martha fussed with the curtain, chattering away about the history of the house. "This room has a special history," she said, her voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "So many happy couples have stayed here over the years. Some say the room itself is blessed with love." I shared a bemused look with Lisa. It was a bit much, but hey, it was all part of the experience, right? "Dinner will be at 7 o'clock, George announced. "We eat together here, like family." With that, they left us to unpack. As soon as the door closed, Lisa flopped onto the bed with a giggle. "Okay, this place is weird," she said, "but kind of adorable, right?" I nodded, but I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was off. "Yeah, it's charming." We freshened up and headed down for dinner. The dining room was as ornate as the rest of the house, with a long table set for four. George and Martha joined us, serving a hearty meal of pot roast and vegetables. The conversation was pleasant enough, mostly George and Martha sharing stories about the area and past guests. But there was something odd about the way they talked, as if they were reciting lines from a script. "So how long have you two been running this place?" I asked. During a lull, Martha and George exchanged a quick glance. "Oh goodness," Martha said with a laugh. "It feels like forever, doesn't it, dear?" George nodded. "Time has a way of blending together out here." It wasn't really an answer, but before I could press further, Martha stood up abruptly. "Who's ready for dessert?" After dinner, we retired to our room. Lisa was charmed by the whole experience, but I couldn't shake my unease. "Don't you think they're a little odd?" I asked as we got ready for bed. Shrugged. "They're old and they live in the middle of nowhere. Of course they're a little eccentric." I tried to let it go, but sleep didn't come easily. The house creaked and groaned in the night, and more than once I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway. The next morning we came down to find breakfast already laid out, but there was no sign of George or Martha. "Hello," I called out. No answer. We ate in uncomfortable silence, the only sound the ticking of an old grandfather clock. As we finished, Martha appeared as if out of thin air, making us both jump. "I hope you slept well," she said, that same fixed smile on her face. "George is out tending the grounds," I thought. Perhaps you'd like a tour of the house." The tour was unsettling. Every room seemed frozen in time, perfectly preserved but untouched. And Martha's commentary was strange, talking about past guests as if they were still here. This was little Timmy's favorite spot, she said, gesturing to a window seat. He would sit here for hours watching for his parents to return. Was Timmy another guest, Lisa asked. Martha's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh yes, from long ago." Such a dear boy. As the tour went on, I began to notice something else. There were no modernities anywhere, no TV, no radio, not even a telephone that I could see. We ended up back in the entrance hall where George was waiting for us. "Beautiful day for a walk," he announced. "Why don't you two go explore the grounds? But be sure to stay on the paths. It's easy to get turned around out there." The warning in his voice was clear. "Don't wander too far outside." Lisa and I finally had a chance to talk privately. "Okay, you're right," she admitted. "This place is weird. Maybe we should leave early." I nodded, relieved. She was on the same page. "Let's pack up and go after lunch. We can make up an excuse about work or something." But when we returned to the house, things took a turn from unsettling to terrifying. Our room had been tidied. While we were out, our bags were unpacked, our clothes put away in ancient dressers, and our car keys, which I distinctly remembered leaving on the bedside table, were nowhere to be found. "George, Martha," I called out, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We seem to have misplaced our keys." Martha appeared in the doorway, that same placid smile on her face. "Oh dear, how careless. But not to worry, you don't need to leave your home now." The way she said it sent chills down my spine. Lisa grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. "That's very kind," I said, forcing a smile. "But we really do need to get back work. You know." Martha's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, once you check into Willow Creek and you don't check out, it happened so fast." George appeared behind her, brandishing an old-fashioned syringe. Lisa screamed as Martha locked the door. I tried to fight to protect Lisa, but whatever was in that syringe worked quickly. As my vision blurred and my limbs grew heavy, I heard Martha's soothing voice. "Don't fight it, dear. You'll be so happy here, just like all the others." The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the gleam in her eyes, not the warm twinkle of a kindly old woman, but the cold, hungry stare of a predator who had just caught her prey. "I don't know how long we've been here now, days, weeks. Time seems to stand still in this place. Lisa and I are never left alone together. They keep us drugged compliant. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other guests, vacant-eyed people in old-fashioned clothes, wandering the halls like ghosts. I try to fight it, to hold on to my memories, my sense of self. But it's getting harder. The drugs, the constant smiling faces of George and Martha, the endless routine of meals and tours, and sitting in the parlor, it's wearing me down. But I haven't given up. Not yet. I'm writing this down, hiding it in the one place they never look inside. The ancient gramophone in the corner of our room. If you're reading this, it means you found yourself in Willow Creek Inn. And if that's the case, God help you. Remember, the smiles are fake, the kindness is a lie. And whatever you do, don't eat the food, don't drink the tea. Fight it for as long as you can. And if you see a chance to escape, run. And don't look back, because once you check into Willow Creek Inn, they'll do everything in their power to make sure you never check out. 4.